Chapter 1965. Taoist Shunchang was slightly surprised by Zhang Yan's words, but he did not ask any questions. After a moment of consideration, he agreed. Taoist Zhang Yan said, "I'll go and guard the outside." Then he bowed and disappeared. He came back with an illusory body, and his real body was still outside the fixed world. He guessed that Zhang Yan might want to talk about some secret matters, so he made an excuse to leave. Taoist Shunchang apologized to Zhang Yan and said, "Taoist friend, please wait for a moment." After the previous experience, he was very careful about the seal. He would check it almost every moment. Before exchanging the Boy of Divine Powers, he had to make sure that there was no mistake. After checking it, he was finally relieved. He sat down and emptied his mind. The two consciousnesses replaced each other. If one of them fell into a state of stillness, the other would naturally come and seize it. Therefore, after a short while, his body was filled with light. When it dissipated, Boy Shunchang had already appeared. Zhang Yan stood with his sleeves behind his back and said, "The person you summoned last time was forced to retreat. What do you plan to do now?" The Boy of Divine Powers said seriously, "He will come again." Zhang Yan said with a smile, "But even if he comes again, he will still be blocked outside. Although I don't know Taoist Shunchang's ability, I can imagine that even if an outsider broke through the seal and came in, he must have a way to stop him. I'm afraid it will be difficult for you." The Boy of Divine Powers grunted and drooped his head. He seemed to be in low spirits. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Taoist friend, do you know that your brother is preparing to split his consciousness to move you out of your real body and then seal you here? In this way, you will have no way out." When he said this, he saw the fear on the Boy of Divine Powers' face. He knew that he had hit the nail on the head, so he changed the topic and said, "But I have a way. If you are willing to follow it, I can persuade your brother not to do this and even let you come and go as you please." Sealing Child Divine Chong seemed to have solved a problem for the time being, but it did not mean that the problem would be solved once and for all. Even if the Shunchang Taoist could escape, he would still need to use the two magical weapons to suppress him. However, this was not the end of it. He still needed to be vigilant against the sealing so that the Shunchang Taoist would not escape. What could not be neglected was that the Taoist in brilliant robe would not give up just because Child Shunchang had been sealed. He would definitely come back here again. After all, the last time this person had arrived, he could be said to have been completely silent. It was only because Boy Shunchang had come out in advance that Taoist Zhang Yan had noticed something unusual, and this had caused his whereabouts to be exposed. If not for the Divine Constant Boy's warning next time, they might not have been able to discover his arrival. This was a very passive situation. From his point of view, Shunchang Boy's mind was pure and his cultivation was profound. He and Shunchang Priest were originally from the same source, so they were naturally close. So why did they have to be enemies? If they could convince him to acknowledge their side and join them, then not only would they have one less problem to deal with, but they would also have gained a great combat strength. It was difficult to say whether this would succeed or not, but it was worth a try no matter what. At this moment, he looked down and saw that Boy Shunchang was looking at him eagerly after listening to his words. He could not help but smile and said, "Taoist friend, after you have obtained your true body, you must not make things difficult for your elder brother. Can you do that?" Boy Shunchang nodded. Zhang Yan continued, "There are things that can be done and things that cannot be done. If in the future you want to devour the treasure spirit, you must discuss it with us. If we do not allow it, then you cannot go. If you can agree, then I can convince your elder brother not to trap you." Boy Shunchang seemed to be a little wronged and lowered his head. "I understand." Zhang Yan nodded his head slightly. Shunchang Boy was pure and honest. He would not lie. If he agreed, then it meant that he agreed. However, he would not pin this matter on just a few words. The reason why he dared to do this was because after he refined a part of Bushtian's Weili, he already had the ability to suppress Boy Shunchang. Even if Boy Shunchang changed his mind in the future, he was confident that he could take him down. He thought for a moment and asked, "Has there been any treasure spirit looking for you recently?" Boy Shunchang shook his head. "No." Zhang Yan changed his mind. Since Boy Shunchang did not feel anything, then the one that was expelled last time should not have made a move. He said, Then let your elder brother come out, I can tell him about this matter. Boy Shunchang responded and sat down with his knees folded. Qi light appeared around him and the qi dynamic gradually disappeared. After a while, priest Shunchang regained control of his body and returned to his original appearance. He raised his head and asked, "Has Taoist friend seen that person? What did he say this time?" Zhang Yan said, "I was about to tell Taoist friend, but this is not a small matter. Why don't we invite Taoist Zhanyuan back first?" Taoist Shunchang said, "Good." He immediately called out to Taoist Zhanyuan. Not long after, Taoist Zhanyuan returned. He could guess that Zhang Yan must have met boy Shunchang to discuss the matter of splitting his will. Zhang Yan looked at the two and said, "You two, if we only talk about cultivation, that person is above the three of us, but his mind is extremely pure. He has always regarded Taoist Shunchang as his elder brother. Just now, I have observed him carefully. Even when he blocked the foreign treasure spirit last time, he did not have any resentment. Therefore, I think it would be a pity to seal him up. But if he can be controlled well, he will definitely become a great help." Priest Shunchang sighed. "I have also thought about what Taoist friend said, but without any restrictions, I am afraid that he will go back on his word." Taoist Zhanyuan also said, "You are right, Taoist Shunchang. It is difficult for us to take oaths. If he is released and still goes against me, it will be difficult to deal with him." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Don't worry, I have a way to subdue him. When that person comes out, I can make him follow I's side first, and there will be no need to worry about him." Priest Shunchang was startled. He lowered his head and thought for a while, then said, "I trust Taoist friend's words, but that person's path is different from mine." This, Zhang Yan shook his head and said, "The division of Tao wills does not necessarily have to be a fight to the death. Since there is a great enemy outside, we can still find a reason to coexist. Even if they were to divide their Tao paths, it would still depend on when it would happen. If that invading existence came, then these spirit refinement almighty cultivators would definitely join forces to fight against the enemy. They wouldn't try to seek outside help. What they needed to do now was to find as many allies as possible and not divide themselves into more enemies." Taoist Zhanyuan pondered for a moment. They had to search for the good fortune fragment, and at the same time, they had to guard against the prying eyes of outsiders. There were too many things that they had to worry about. If Zhang Yan's words were true and they could win over Shunchang Boy, it would make up for their shortcomings. Thinking of this, Taoist Zhanyuan was also inclined to this idea. He asked tentatively, "Taoist Zhang, can that person agree to such a condition?" Zhang Yan said, "I have talked with that person just now, and I have already convinced him. After Taoist Shunchang divides his consciousness into two, as long as he is not sealed, he will be willing to listen to me." Priest Shunchang thought for a while and nodded. "If that is the case, then it will be great." Taoist Zhanyuan said, "There's no time to lose. You might as well separate that person's consciousness as soon as possible." Taoist Shunchang nodded and said, "Then I'll have to trouble the two of you, guardians." Taoist Zhanyuan returned the greeting and said, "Rest assured, Taoist Zhanyuan." Taoist Shunchang sat cross-legged, then took out an object from his sleeve and placed it in front of Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan looked over and saw that the object was shaped like a gourd. There was a lustrous luster on its surface, but it gave off a feeling that it had yet to mature. It was originally an object of nature, but it lacked a bit of spirituality to the extent that it was incomplete. After sitting in silence for a while, Taoist Shunchang raised his finger and cut his body. In an instant, his body turned into two balls of light. One stayed where it was, while the other floated toward the treasure embryo and disappeared into it. At the same time, in the depths of the void, Taoist Yihan was engrossed in swallowing and spitting out a pearl that was surrounded by a clear light. Suddenly, he sensed something and looked toward a certain boundary. He muttered, "This feeling, could it be that something has happened to the treasure spirit that called me?" He originally wanted to find out what was going on, but after suffering a big loss last time, he was very afraid of Zhang Yan and the others, especially Bu Shutian's Weili, who made him feel uneasy. Before obtaining more means, even if an opportunity presented itself, he would not dare to go alone. After staring at it for a while, He collected his thoughts and once again swallowed and spat out the pearl. In the time of meditation, Taoist Shenchang's figure quickly returned to his original appearance, but after all, he had separated a part of his consciousness, so his aura seemed a little weaker. After the ball of light entered the treasure embryo, circles of spiritual light began to flow out from it, and then it was completely engulfed by the brilliance. After a few breaths, it disappeared just now. When all the brilliance faded, Taoist Shenchang stood there and bowed to Taoist Shen, saying, "Greetings, elder brother." Taoist Shenchang sighed. He could feel that the separation of consciousness was very successful, and the reason was that Taoist Shenchang did not resist at all. Obviously, he was really willing to listen to their orders. He reminded, "Since you have manifested outside, you have also enjoyed the merit of creation. Remember not to be willful and reckless in the future." Taoist Shenchang hummed and puffed out his chest. He said loudly, "I will remember." Taoist Shenchang looked around and lamented, "This restrictive formation should not exist anymore." With a flick of his sleeve, the whole world dissolved, and the black and white colors faded away. What appeared in front of everyone was the color of mountains and rivers, a beautiful world. Zhang Yan saw the tiny golden pearl fly out and hover in the void. With a thought, it flew into his sleeve. At this moment, Taoist Shenchang stood up. He extended his hand and a Taoist robe appeared on his arm. He said to Zhang Yan, "I've said before that if fellow Taoist can help me free myself, I will give you a treasure. Now that I've said it, please accept it." Zhang Yan thought for a while and did not reject the offer. Instead, he reached out his hand and took it. With an extra primordial treasure by his side, he would have a better chance of winning in a fight. Now that he was standing beside Shenchang Taoist, it would be a good thing for him to have his strength increased. He said, "Since this is done, I will take my leave. If there is anything else, you can come and call me." Taoist Shenchang bowed solemnly and said, "Take care, my friend." Zhang Yan looked at Taoist boy and said, "Please come with me, my friend." Taoist boy obediently came up and grabbed a corner of his sleeve. He nodded, and with a thought he brought Taoist boy away. Chapter 1966. Zhang Yan waited for his consciousness to return to his real body. Shenchang boy was attracted by his qi dynamic and came along with him. He stopped and looked at his surroundings with his eyes wide open. Ever since he gained consciousness, he had been sealed in frozen world. Although he could sense the outside world when his consciousness alternated, this was the first time he came to the void. In fact, there was nothing to see here except for the countless twinkling stars of life and death, and the collision of spiritual power. But he still seemed to be in high spirits. Zhang Yan shook his head and smiled. This boy was indeed a child, so he took care of him and said, "Just now that you have a real body, you can first recover your spiritual power and cultivation. We can talk about other things when your body is complete." Bushutian was the key, so he would not let Shenchang boy enter. He would only restrict him to the depths of his own spiritual power. Even if there were any changes, he would be able to react immediately. Shenchang boy grunted and sat down. After a few breaths, several branches slowly grew out of his body. The lower branch quickly propped up a huge lotus leaf with dewdrops rolling back and forth. The branch that grew to the top grew a leaf cover, as if a reed was built. Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. This was because spirit refinement was a constant clash of magical power. Unless one opened up the world sealing technique, everything that was produced in the void silence would only increase the burden on one's body. Normally, no one would do this. However, Shenchang boy's lotus leaf was not formed by himself. It was extracted from the treasure fetus that had not completely fused. It was obvious that after the two fused, the treasure fetus was nourished. Judging from the lotus leaf, the treasure fetus just now saw was not a gourd, but a lotus node. It was just that it had not fully grown, so it looked similar. This meant that there might be more to this thing, but it was broken for some reason. What Taoist Zhan Yuan found was only a part of it. For some reason, he felt that this thing was not simple. He thought about it. Shenchang boy could feel the treasure fetus and treasure spirit outside, so maybe he could also feel where the other broken treasure fetus were. When he thought of this, he turned around and saw boy Shunchang sitting on the lotus leaf with his arms around his knees. He seemed to have fallen asleep. He understood that after Shunchang split his consciousness into two, he was originally one person becoming two. Although there seemed to be no change on the surface, in actual fact, each individual's mana and cultivation had been weakened, and it would take a period of time to recover. At this moment, boy Shunchang was recovering. Likewise, Taoist Shunchang should also be recovering. If enemies were to attack them during this period, they could only rely on Taoist Zhanyuan and Taoist Zhanyuan to resist them. He tried to sense it, but there was no obvious sign in his heart. Then there should be no movement nearby. Thereupon he shook his sleeve and took out the Taoist robe. It had originally belonged to Taoist Shunchang. However, logically speaking, ever since Taoist Shunchang's metamorphosis, he no longer had any direct connection to it. If he had even the slightest connection to it, then he could not be considered to have transcended. However, he did not skip the inspection. After carefully examining it for a moment, he sent his mind into it. After straightening out the aura, he tried to deduce it again in his mind to see if there was anything wrong with it. He believed that as long as Taoist Shunchang was not short-sighted, he would not tamper with it. However, things were different now. Since spirit-refining cultivators were not bound by oaths, they had to be careful in everything. Moreover, this item was to be used in battle. Sometimes, it was only a small detail that determined the outcome of a battle. Therefore, he would not allow any possible hidden dangers to exist. In his opinion, although he was on the same side as Taoist Shunchang at this moment, it was only because there was an external threat. No one could predict what would happen in the future. Sometimes, the change of friend or foe between spirit-refining cultivators was unexpected, so it was necessary to be more cautious. After repeatedly examining it, he cleanly expelled all the residual aura in it. Then, with a thought, he guided a part of the Buxu Tian Weili over. He still remembered that Taoist Yi Han had tried several times to prevent the treasure of fortune in his hand from directly confronting the Weili. However, he did not know why. Now that he had the same thing, he would try to find out what was going on. The Weili came over and poured into the treasure robe, but unexpectedly, nothing strange happened. He thought for a moment and thought of a possibility. He immediately refined the item and became the owner of the treasure. Then, he drove the Weili into it again. This time, he noticed that everywhere this mighty force passed, the vital energy imprint he left behind actually seemed as if it was being washed away by a wave, and it was gradually fading away. After a short moment, it became an ownerless object once more. He calculated again and understood in his heart. The Buxu Tian Weili had the ability to cleanse the treasure of fortune, and it seemed that it could not tolerate any impurities. However, the reason why Taoist Shunchang was afraid of the Weili was not because of this. If the treasure had been repeatedly refined by a cultivator, the aura imprint would not be easily erased. However, it was precisely because of this that it became a threat to the Taoist Shunchang. The Taoist Shunchang was a treasure spirit, so he was afraid that the Buxu Tian Weili would follow the aura imprint and invade his consciousness. This would not cause any direct harm to the Taoist Shunchang, but it could erase his perception of the world. If it was erased too much, there was a possibility that he would fall into eternal silence. Of course, if it really came to that step, he could first cut off the connection and prevent this from happening. However, who would dare to do this in a battle? After understanding this, Zhang Yan knew that he had another killing move in his hands. If the Taoist Shunchang dared to come again, he could try it. With the Weili's cleansing, he no longer had any doubts. He poured his spiritual power and consciousness into the Taoist robe. After a long time, the robe turned into specks of light and finally gathered on his body. At a glance, it was shining with a golden light. With a thought, it turned black. After a brief inspection, he found that there were many uses to this robe. If he wanted to, he could naturally restrain his spiritual power and not be discovered by others. However, he would not do this. He had not passed the Jiazhen test and had not opened the stopped world, so the protection of spiritual power was necessary. After sorting everything out, he saw that there was nothing else to look at, so he sat down and his consciousness quickly sank into Bu Shuyan. Under the threat of that existence coming at any time, the spirit refinement cultivators were trying to increase their strength. Under such circumstances, everyone was actually being forced to move forward. If they slacked off even a little bit, they might not even have to wait for that existence to arrive. Their peers would come and deal with them first. It was the same for him. He needed to make the best use of his time to increase his cultivation. At this moment, somewhere in the desolate void, Taoist Ihan, after a long period of hard work, finally swallowing the pearl in his mouth. In the end, it disappeared and a blue light appeared on his body. His entire body was bathed in a dense and clear air. When these phenomena disappeared, he felt that his strength had increased by another level, and he could not help but feel refreshed. At this moment, he had the thought of going to the stopped world, so he tried to sense it, but found that something was wrong. In his senses, the treasure spirit that called him to go seemed to have broken free from the seal and was no longer in the original place. He could not help but think, could it be that after I came last time, that group of people actually let down their guard and let this one escape? After thinking about it, he felt that the possibility was very high. If that's the case, it will be convenient for me to do things. He did everything possible to find boy Shunchang, not to save him, but to devour him. Previously, although he felt that boy Shunchang's cultivation was a level higher than his, he had two supreme treasures of fortune with him. Under the premise that no one else interfered, he thought that he could easily take down the other party. However, the result was not what he wanted. Before he could reach the treasure spirit, he was repelled by the guardian. Now that his cultivation had improved greatly, he had another idea in his mind. Just as he was thinking, he suddenly felt a strand of aura coming towards him. He couldn't help but reveal a look of pleasant surprise. With a thought, he followed that strand of aura. In the blink of an eye, he found himself in a frozen world. However, other than a water mirror, there was nothing else here. He took a step forward, and his body slowly sank into the mirror. After a while, he landed in a cave abode. Above him sat a beautiful female Taoist, dressed in a dark purple Taoist robe. Her hands were placed on her knees. He cupped his hands and said happily, "I didn't expect you to come out of seclusion." The female Taoist said in the ethereal spirit language, "This time, after refining the drip truth, my cultivation has increased by a level. I still have to thank you for your help last time." Taoist Ihan said, "You're being too polite." The female Taoist looked over and said, "Looking at you, you didn't manage to get the treasure spirit that was sealed, right?" Taoist Ihan snorted, and in a resentful tone, he roughly described the situation. In the end, he blamed the failure on ancestor Yao Han. "I heard what you said, so I went to look for Taoist Yao Han. However, I came to him twice and even promised him benefits, but he was not willing to help me. I had to go alone, and that was why I couldn't get it. I thought that Yao Han had ulterior motives, and was definitely not willing to repay your favor." The female Taoist said lightly, "Yao Han is a scheming person. He must have expected that before he repaid his favor, I will not fall out with him, so he ignored you. It's just that this person is still useful, so don't bother about him now." She thought for a while. "Just now, you said that one of the guardian's mana caused you to feel fear?" Taoist Ihan revealed a look of fear. "Yes, I only felt that the mana contained an inexplicable Wei, which made me tremble in fear. To avoid any accidents, I did not dare to use my treasure to collide with it." The female Taoist's eyes showed a hint of surprise. She raised her hand, pinched her fingers and calculated for a moment, and said, "The mana that fellow Taoist mentioned, I can't feel it at all. This is related to my previous deduction, so I should go and take a look." Taoist Ihan's spirit was lifted, and he said happily, "Could it be that fellow Taoist is willing to help me get the treasure spirit?" The female Taoist said calmly, "Before that person comes, I don't want to make enemies for no reason. Wait until I see the person guarding the gate. If he suits me, then I will let him go. If he doesn't, then I will just take his merit." Chapter 1967. Amidst the silence, the lotus leaf moved a little and then opened up. Boy Shunchang opened up his two small hands and stretched his body. He then rubbed his eyes and looked around. After a while, he revealed a distressed expression and said, "I'm hungry." Zhang Yan, who was in a meditative state, noticed that he had woken up. Though the treasured spirits of creation were blessed by the heavens, they were limited by their birth. To improve their cultivation, they could only rely on stealing from their own kind. Therefore, the way to do things was simple. They would steal from their own kind, refine them, and repeat the process. However, the improvement of their cultivation was not enough to reach the heavens in one step. The refining process was very long. It had been a long time since boy Changxing stole the treasure fetus, so he should have completely refined it. Therefore, he began to search for his next target. He would not purposely stop him. However, he had to decide when and how to do it. He could not let him do whatever he wanted. He said, "Friend, did you sense where the person who came last time was?" Boy Xinchang grunted and raised his head. "That person is coming." Zhang Yan's eyes suddenly turned deep and serene. Earlier, he had also sensed something in his heart. Coupled with what the divine Chang boy had said, the answer was already very clear. A battle was perhaps unavoidable. However, he did not know how many people would come after the previous failure. That Taoist in bright robe was also a treasured spirit. If he could suppress him, then he could hand him over to boy Changxing. As for whether or not boy Changxing's cultivation would be able to suppress him, there was no need to worry. He had Busu Tian to rely on, so his cultivation would improve even faster. By then, he would be able to use more of Busu Tian's Weili. When he thought up to here, he thought of something and said, "Fellow Taoist, your magic power is completely recovered now. I wonder if you can establish the world sealing technique?" Boy Changxing nodded, then shook his head. Zhang Yan raised an eyebrow and asked a few more questions. Only then did he realize that it was not that boy Changxing could not do it, but he was unwilling to do it. Only when he was outside the fixed world could his senses become sharper. Moreover, his consciousness had been sealed inside the fixed world ever since he was born. Therefore, to him, this was a restriction, not a protection. He was not too concerned about this. It was best if boy Xinchang did not have to stop the world, and he could save a lot of effort. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, he would need to obtain permission to enter the serene world. If he was not careful, he might even hide from him. He said, "If that person comes again, I can join forces with you to capture him. That treasure spirit can be your food." Boy Divine Chang's eyes lit up and he nodded. While he was speaking, Zhang Yan suddenly felt a wave of dharmic energy fluctuation coming over. Based on its vital energy, it ought to be the Taoist in brilliant clothes, and he was trying to investigate Zhang Yan's ability. This was because once the magic power of the spirit ascension cultivators started to clash, some information about each other would be leaked to the other party. This was unavoidable. Fortunately, when his opponents tried to understand him, he would also know some things about them. The only difference here was that the person with a higher cultivation would be able to obtain more information. However, he would not allow the other party to do as he pleased. With a thought, the jade water droplet was activated, slightly concealing himself and many other realms. He had not reached the stage of understanding the truth, so he could not completely conceal himself. However, he could slightly confuse the other party, making it difficult for him to see the truth. After the owner of the dharmic energy realized that he could not obtain much information, he gradually faded away until he almost disappeared. Zhang Yan understood that the other party would not make this effort for nothing. If there were no accidents, it would come soon. On the other side, after Taoist Yi Han retracted his dharmic energy, he confirmed that Zhang Yan was alone. Instantly, he became restless and said to the female Taoist, "Fellow Taoist, there is only one person on the other side, and the treasure spirit is under his protection. This is a great opportunity." The female Taoist calculated with her heart, but she got many different results. She thought for a while and said, "There are many variables here, we cannot be careless. How about this? Go to where Yao Han and the others are and ask them to do this." She then sent a message using her divine will. Taoist Yi Han was startled, but he did not forget what happened last time. He said angrily, "I'm afraid Yao Han will not agree so easily." The female Taoist said lightly, "Fellow Taoist, just do as I said." Taoist Yi Han had no choice but to follow the direction of Yao Han and the other's dermic energy. In a flash, he arrived at the latter's location. Ancestor Yao Han and the others had already sensed his arrival, so they greeted him respectfully. Taoist Yi Han casually returned the greeting and said, "Fellow Taoists, I have already told fellow Taoist Chao Ying about what happened last time." At this point, he deliberately stopped and stared coldly at Ancestor Yao Han and the others. As soon as he arrived, he acted as if he was going to punish Ancestor Yao Han, but in the end, he found that Ancestor Yao Han's expression was calm, as if he was not afraid at all. Ancestor Yao Han was not pretending to be calm. If the person behind Taoist Yi Han wanted to do anything to them, there was no need for him to say all this. Moreover, they were not treasure spirits, so there was no reason for them to fight each other. It would be fine if the other party could drive them into eternal silence, but since they did not have the ability to do so, it was not wise for them to become enemies. He cupped his hands and said, "May I ask what fellow Taoist Chao Ying has to say? Is it still about the treasure spirit from last time?" Seeing him so calm, Taoist Yi Han snorted and said, "That's right. This time, fellow Taoist Chao Ying will be working with me, and I hope that you can help." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Do you want us to attack the fixed world with you too?" Taoist Yi Han said, "No, the treasure spirit has been freed and has gone to another place. There is someone guarding it, but we have deduced that if this person is attacked, the fixed world guardian will come to his rescue. This time, we don't need you to do anything, just pretend to attack and hold the fixed world guardian in place." Ancestor Yao Han did not agree immediately and said, "Then is this your request, or is it fellow Taoist Chao Ying's idea?" Taoist Yi Han sneered and said, "This is my private request. Whether you will help or not depends on your willingness." Ancestor Yao Han cupped his hands and said, "We agree, but I hope that you will not ask us to help for nothing." Taoist Yi Han was taken aback. He didn't expect Meng Qi to agree so readily. He snorted and said, "I only hope that fellow Taoist doesn't forget what you said when the time comes." With a wave of his sleeve, he turned around and left. Taoist Yu Qiu was puzzled and asked, "Fellow Taoist Yao Han, since it is Yi Han's request, it has nothing to do with that person? Why did you agree?" Forefather Yao Han said, "It's different this time. Last time, it was clear that only one person benefited from it. This time, it's clear that fellow Taoist Zhao Ying wants it. If I refuse, I won't be giving her face." Taoist Yu Qiu calculated and tried to sense the fluctuations of magic power and said with certainty, "The person Yi Han is looking for this time is Taoist Zhang." Taoist Yu Qiu sighed and said, "That Taoist Zhang has many tricks up his sleeves. I don't think they will get what they want." Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, "Isn't that good? Just now, Bu Shutian's secret can be hidden, and the others can force out Taoist Zhang's secret on my behalf." After the magic power confrontation, Zhang Yan waited quietly. After a long time, he suddenly opened his eyes and said, "It's here." Child God Chang was standing beside him, biting his finger and looking at the depths of the void with anticipation. Not long after, there were specks of light in the silence. A beautiful female Taoist with crimson lips held a glass ruby in her hand and stepped on a cloud. The Taoist in bright clothes from last time was by her side. When they got close, the female Taoist bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist. Chao Ying greets me." Zhang Yan returned the greeting. Even though the other party's tone was gentle, the pressure from her magic power was very invasive. He nodded and said, "So it is fellow Taoist Chao Ying. I don't seem to be friends with you, so why are you here?" Chao Ying looked at Child God Chang and said, "I am here for this fellow Taoist." Even though her gaze was gentle, the invasive intent in the depths of her eyes could not be concealed. Among the treasure spirits of creation, there were very few who were as pure as Child God Chang. This made it difficult for them to sense the existence of the same kind. Therefore, it was as difficult for them to find the same kind of existence as it was for Taoist cultivators to find the fragments of creation. However, Child God Chang could easily find Taoist Yi Han and summon him. This ability was very important to her. If she could devour him, she would have the same ability. Shenchang boy ignored her and just stared at Taoist Yihan. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "As far as I know, fellow Taoist Shenchang has nothing to do with the two of you." Taoist Yihan stood up and said loudly, "How can you say that we have nothing to do with each other? Earlier, I heard this fellow Taoist call for help and learned that he was sealed in a certain serene world. That's why I came to look for him, hoping to free him. However, I was forced to retreat by the guards. Although you haven't shown yourself, I know that you're one of the people who tried to stop me. I was too rash earlier, but I came here today to discuss something with you. This fellow Taoist Shenchang is the same as me, so I hope you can let him go." Zhang Yan said calmly, "Where fellow Taoist Shenchang goes is his own business." He looked at Child God Chang and said, "Are you willing to go with them?" Child God Chang shook his head vigorously. Taoist Yihan sneered and said to Child God Chang, "Fellow Taoist Shenchang, don't be deceived by him. He originally sealed you, but now he has released you. I don't know why, but he wants to make use of your ability. You must not be fooled. We are from the same origin. If you come to me, you can do whatever you want and no one will." But when he said this, Chao Ying stretched out her hand and stopped him from continuing. Taoist Yihan was surprised and said, "Fellow Taoist, what are you?" Chao Ying said, "This fellow Taoist Shenchang has a pure mind. We can't hide our intentions from him. There's no need to waste our breath." She looked at Zhang Yan again and said in a serious tone, "If we want to fulfill our wish, we still have to discuss Tao skills with this person here." Chapter 1968. Taoist Yihan saw that Shenchang boy was innocent, so he wanted to persuade him to take the initiative to join him. However, Chao Ying's words dispelled his idea. Fortunately, the fight was in line with his wishes. This time, they came prepared. They had arranged their chess pieces in advance, and each of them had a treasure of fate. Among the two opponents, he judged that Taoist Zhang's cultivation level was at most similar to his, so he only needed to guard against the inexplicable Wei from last time. Shenchang boy, on the other hand, had never experienced a battle, so he was sure to win. Zhang Yan sensed that the other side was about to fight, so he turned to Shenchang boy and said, "Since you invited him, I'll leave him to you. However, you don't have any treasures with you, so you need to be careful." Shenchang boy responded with a joyful tone. After receiving the Taoist robe given to Zhang Yan by Taoist priest Shenchang and refining Bushu Tian's mighty power, he was able to attack and defend at the same time. He believed that he could take on two opponents at the same time, but he did not know the exact details of his opponents, and he did not know if there were only two of them. However, Taoist Yihan was indeed a weak point. After the last fight, he had almost exposed all of his tricks. After such a long time, there shouldn't be too many changes. At most, he would have gained another supreme treasure of fortune. Since Child Shenchang was able to summon this person, he believed that he should be able to defeat his opponent. Even if there were any mistakes, he could make up for it in time. After giving his instructions, he did not wait for his opponent to make a move. Instead, he activated his magic power and pressed it against Chao Ying. Chao Ying was slightly surprised. She did not expect that Zhang Yan would attack without hesitation. When she saw the direction of the magic power, she immediately understood his intention. However, after thinking for a while, she did not forcibly stop him, because it was exactly what she wanted. She thought that Zhang Yan was the real enemy. If he was eliminated, Shenchang boy would be easy to deal with. After thinking for a while, she said, "I'll take care of this person. You just need to block the other one for me." Taoist Yihan was full of confidence and replied, "Leave it to me." Just as they were about to attack, Taoist Zhanya also noticed something. After a brief examination, he knew what was going on. He wanted to help, but Taoist Shenchang still needed someone to protect him, so he hesitated. Shenchang Taoist's cultivation was not as profound as Shenchang Taoist's, and he was the one who took the initiative to separate his consciousness. His strength had not fully recovered, and he was not sure what the other party's real goal was. What if it was just a feint, and the real target was Dingshi? Taoist Shenchang also sensed Taoist Zhanyuan's hesitation at this moment. He could tell that Taoist Zhanyuan was hesitating, so he said, "Fellow Taoist, you can go to fellow Taoist Zhang's place to help." What's more, the one who attacked us is a treasure spirit. If my brother is captured and refined by this person, his cultivation will definitely rise to a higher level. When that happens, he will definitely come looking for me. When Taoist Zhang Yun heard this, he cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Taoist, please be careful." He left his ethereal body here, and with a turn of his consciousness, he returned to his real body. Just as he was about to rush over to help, he suddenly felt an aura descend upon him. Then, 3 streams of mana were drawn over, and in an instant, 3 Taoists landed in front of him. Taoist Zhang Yuan's expression froze. He looked over and recognized the 3 patriarchs. He asked coldly, "What do you want?" Patriarch Xiao Han cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist. We came here on someone's request, and we don't want to fight with you. If you stay here and don't move, it will be a good thing for both of us." Taoist Zhang Yuan frowned. Even if he could defeat the 3 Taoists, he couldn't capture them. Moreover, he couldn't just leave for Taoist Chunchang's sake. For the same reason, the 3 Taoists needed to keep him here, and he needed to keep the 3 Taoists here to prevent them from interfering with Zhang Yan. When Patriarch Xiao Han and the other Taoists saw that Taoist Zhang Yuan didn't attack them, they felt slightly relieved. After all, their cultivation and magic power were not as strong as Zhang Yuan's. If Taoist Zhang Yuan insisted on making things difficult for them, even if they could stop him, it would be a strenuous and unrewarding effort. It would be best if they could confront him here. The light in Chao Ying's eyes shifted, and the transcendence energy that was surging towards her from all directions was instantly blocked by her. However, what surprised her was that Zhang Yan's transcendence energy was not the slightest bit weaker than hers. In fact, it was faintly suppressing hers. However, it wasn't easy to determine the winner in a battle of magic power. Relying on her profound cultivation, she began to increase her magic power. Zhang Yan's cultivation was no longer the same as before. At this moment, even if he didn't use the remnant jade to deduce, it wouldn't be difficult for him to keep up with his opponent's pace. Moreover, his opponent was a treasure spirit. Even if his cultivation was higher than his luck might not be as good as his. However, at this moment, he didn't want to overwhelm his opponent in terms of magic power. Even if he could temporarily gain the upper hand, he wouldn't be able to defeat his opponent. Even if he could achieve this, it wouldn't make much sense. His opponent could make a comeback next time. Therefore, he needed to find an opportunity to completely suppress his opponent. In his mind, the strategy he came up with was to try to maintain a stalemate as much as possible. This time, his opponent definitely didn't want to go back empty-handed. In a situation where his attacks were futile, he couldn't help but use his trump card. Once he had a general understanding of this, he would find a way to counterattack. That way, he would have a greater chance of success. Of course, he couldn't go too far and let his opponent see through his intentions at a glance. Therefore, the situation needed to be balanced. At this moment, he paid a little attention to Xinchang Boy and saw that both of them were also in a collision of magic power. Obviously, Taoist Yi Han was no match for his opponent. He took out the golden bell and shook it continuously, repelling the attacking magic power. However, after all, there was a big difference in their cultivation. Without using other magical weapons, he was unable to counterattack. Zhang Yan's mind turned. Looking at Taoist Yi Han's behavior, he didn't seem to be in a hurry to win. He was only responsible for restraining his opponent. There was no doubt that he was waiting for a winner to be decided before deciding whether to advance or retreat. This could not be called a strange plan, but it was considered very stable. Since there were no changes here, he could fight with his opponent with all his strength. Therefore, with a thought, he activated the Tai golden bead. A golden light instantly swayed and hit Chao Ying. When Chao Ying saw the Tai golden bead coming, she did not panic. She swung the glass rui scepter in her hand and blocked the Tai golden bead. However, under this violent collision, the rui scepter shattered into pieces. However, she did not care. She gently flicked her wrist and channeled her magic power. The countless pieces merged together and returned to their original appearance. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed slightly. Originally, the Tai golden bead could attack continuously with just a thought. It could often exhaust the opponent's defense, or at least make them flustered for a while. However, this time, because it was restrained by the Rui scepter, it seemed to be stuck in mud. Its attacks could not be connected for a while and it had lost its previous advantage. However, he also saw that although the object could offset any external force and could instantly restore itself even if it was destroyed, it was not a creation treasure. It was only refined from ordinary creation fragments. Its foundation could not be compared to his Tai golden bead. It could be used once or twice, but after dozens or hundreds of collisions, he did not believe that it could withstand it. Even if it could, the opponent would have to pay a considerable price. Thinking to this point, he summoned the treasure back and smashed it down again. Chao Ying was still using the method just now to deal with it. Although she seemed to have the upper hand, she was still extremely cautious. After listening to Taoist Yi Han's words, she was especially concerned about the unknown Wei Li. Although she did not see Zhang Yan using it, she was sure that he was trying to hide it. Originally, she was prepared to slowly suppress him and it would not be difficult to force him out. However, at this moment, she realized that the opponent's attacks were swift and fierce. If this continued, it would be difficult to create pressure. After thinking for a while, she decided to change her strategy. She turned her eyes and said, "Since you are so persistent, do you think that Taoist Qing Xing will come to help? I have given him an item, which is a promise that he will not interfere in this matter." When Zhang Yan heard this, he laughed in his heart. Chao Ying had learned a lot of things during the previous confrontation of mana. However, she seemed to be mistaken about one thing. Although he had met Taoist Qing Xing once, that was all. He did not have any agreement with him and had never counted on him. Therefore, these words were useless to him. This person had probably fought with the Jade Creation Treasure Spirit more often than not and rarely had conflicts with other cultivators. Otherwise, he should know that cultivators like him who had cultivated all the way up had a perfect state of mind. Not to mention that such things did not happen, even if there were, he would not be moved by words at all. This was an unnecessary move. Chao Ying did not know that a single sentence from her could let Zhang Yan see through so many things. She only noticed that Zhang Yan's state of mind was not the slightest bit affected and did not reveal any flaws. She was a cautious person. She was prepared to take advantage of the situation to launch an attack, but she immediately held back and prepared to look for another opportunity. However, under the repeated attacks of the Tai gold bead, the glass scepter would shatter every time. Although it could still reform, it became weaker and weaker. If this continued, there was a possibility that it would collapse. She had refined this treasure for a long time. She did not want to easily lose it here, so she kept it in her sleeve to be nurtured again. However, without this object, the attacks of the Tai gold bead became swift and fierce. She realized that it was difficult to break through the situation with the current method, so she did not conceal it anymore. She pressed her fingers together and pointed at her hair, and a silver light shot out. When Zhang Yan saw this, his eyes flickered slightly. The treasured robe on his body had not been seen by the other. If he ignored this attack and used the damaged jade to raise his mana and suppress it, then would he be able to seize the opportunity to seal the person in one go? But after thinking about it again, he gave up on this thought. It was not that he had any warning signs in his heart, but from the actions of the other party, he could see that this was an extremely cautious person. It could also be called conservative. Such a person would not neglect his own defense, and would even place it first. He would not allow his opponent to have any defensive treasures on him. If his attack did not hit, he might instead expose his killing move. Thus, he decided to be careful and defend. He flicked his sleeve, and the crystal jade water droplet instantly dissolved and wrapped around his body. But the silver light was mysterious. At this moment, with a flash and a jump, it actually leaped over this layer of barrier and suddenly rushed in front of him. Chapter 1969. Zhang Yan narrowed his eyes when he saw the silver thorn break through the barrier as if it was nothing. He was able to sense that this silver thorn was undoubtedly a supreme treasure of creation. His crystal jade water droplet was refined from a fragment of fortune. Its foundation was the same as his opponent's glass rui. It was expected that it could not block this item. Before he received the Taoist robe, He did not have a supreme treasure of fortune with him. However, he had the Tai golden bead. This item would arrive as soon as it was released. In fact, there was no process. It was just that the mighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm had their mana on the outside. This was also a part of them. Therefore, when this treasure was blasted into the mana, it was blocked. This would give the opponent time to react. However, the silver thorn before him was different. After it was released, it needed to fly over from afar. However, no mana or treasure could block it. Therefore, there must be a mystery here. He did not act rashly. He immediately observed the chi movement and deduced. Soon he found out what was going on. If this treasure flew towards someone, then that person had to calculate the changes in chi movement before the treasure arrived. If he did not do this, he would definitely be shot and there was no chance of escaping. The mystery was that this treasure was in the pre-celestial state. If one did not calculate it, then it was the same as admitting that this item could hurt him. When facing this item, it all depended on the cultivator's Tao. If one's cultivation was not high enough, or if one was careless, then one would definitely not be able to avoid it. Even if this was not an offensive treasure, not many people could withstand it. After he understood all of this, he quickly deduced the changes in the vital energy within it, and right at the instant he finished deducing it, the object swayed and instantly vanished into nothingness. He knew that this treasure did not really disappear. As long as the master was still there, it would continue to pester him. It would jump out from time to time to threaten the opponent. Every time he saw it, he had to try to calculate the changes in chi movement. Otherwise, he would still be stabbed by it. However, to fight against the enemy, one had to constantly raise mana. This also required the cultivator to calculate. If he was restrained by this item, then a moment of carelessness could cause him to not be able to keep up with the opponent's changes and lead to defeat. He pondered for a moment, but did not pay too much attention to it. If he didn't have a way to deal with it, he might be caught by it and be restrained. However, he had the jade fragment, so even if he couldn't escape, he wasn't afraid. Moreover, if Bushutian used his Weili, he believed that he could force it to retreat, so he didn't need to worry about it. In the past, Chowing had used this treasure to deal with the treasure spirits of the same kind. This was because even if the treasure spirits had enough cultivation, their temperament was greatly flawed, so they were easily suppressed by Chao Ying. Even if he could hold on for a while under the effect of this treasure, if the battle dragged on for too long, he would gradually reveal an opening, and it would be very easy for him to obtain it. She originally had great confidence in this, but as the battle progressed, she noticed that Zhang Yan was completely unlike his previous opponents, and he dealt with her with extreme ease. Even though the silver spikes flew out from time to time, they would be easily dealt with by him every single time. Not only that, the changes in his magic power weren't affected in the slightest, and he had never been left behind by her. After a long time, seeing that she still couldn't win, she started to become impatient. Ever since her cultivation had reached a certain level, she had always been successful in her battles. But this time, even though there was no clear winner, she felt that she wouldn't be able to get what she wanted this time. Thinking of this, her attacks unknowingly became more urgent. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. Up until now, he had been following his plan, patiently waiting for an opportunity to attack. Now, he keenly felt that the power of the treasure spirit was fluctuating, and it wasn't as steady as before. This was clearly a sign that the treasure spirit's mind was in a mess. The state of mind of these treasure spirits was more easily shaken than he had expected, and they couldn't keep their cool so quickly. He had a lot of battle experience, and he knew that when a person wanted to achieve a certain goal but couldn't achieve it, they would most likely speed up their attacks, hoping to break out of the situation as soon as possible. And when they still couldn't achieve anything by doing this, it would be even more urgent, and it would easily disrupt the plan they had made in advance. Just like the Yao Han ancestor and the others, even if their cultivation and Fa Li weren't strong enough, they wouldn't reveal such a flaw. If one wanted to defeat such a person, they could only rely on their own fighting ability. The strong was strong, the weak was weak, and there were no loopholes to exploit. But the enemy in front of him, because of her unstable state of mind, seemed to be weak or strong, and this was a good thing for him. This way, he would be able to seize more opportunities. Zhao Ying continued to urge her Fa Li, but the effect wasn't great. The battlefield was the same as before, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make any progress. She gradually couldn't hold back anymore. But her past battle experience reminded her that she couldn't act recklessly at a time like this, or else it would be even more difficult to win. Relying on this trace of calmness to maintain herself, she tried to restrain herself, and began to wonder if she should give up on Zhang Yan, and turn to Shunchang Boy as her target, and open a gap from there. After having this thought, she began to secretly pay attention. But she soon gave up on this idea, because every time her Fa Li retreated slightly, Zhang Yan's Fa Li would immediately suppress it. If she dared to withdraw, even if she was unharmed, she wouldn't be able to do anything else. Both sides fought like this for a long time, but the battle was still lukewarm, just like the beginning of the battle, and it seemed like it could continue like this. Zhao Ying frowned. Now she was sure that if she didn't use a killing move, then without any external influence, she wouldn't be able to do anything to her opponent. Because her patience had reached its limit, she no longer held back. With a wave of her sleeve, countless tiny flower petals flew out. However, they didn't fly towards Zhang Yan. Instead, they scattered in all directions. Zhang Yan quickly felt the power of this item. The moment the petals touched his Fa Li, it would quickly merge with him. In an instant, he felt as if his Fa Li was under a lot of burden, and the changes in his Fa Li became much slower. During the spirit refinement, the Fa Li collided with each other. However, as long as one hasn't reached the stage of understanding the truth, there was no way to hide it. This treasure made full use of this point. The number of petals seemed endless, which meant that the situation would gradually worsen. If he didn't solve it, then it would reach a point where he couldn't handle it. He immediately understood that this was another problem that needed to be solved. He realized that the treasures that the other party took out were not too powerful, but they were very effective when used in battle. Those who were slightly lacking in cultivation would not be able to deal with them. Fortunately, he was not one of them. On the contrary, deducing and changing was exactly what he was good at. With a thought in his mind, he immediately found the key point. With a jolt of mana, the petals were expelled one by one from the center. Once Zhao Ying started, she didn't stop there. She took out a butterfly ring from her sleeve with 3 fingers. With a flick of her finger, it turned into a living creature, fluttered its wings and flew around. After a short while, it turned into ashes. Then, a worm the size of a grain of rice was born from nothingness. It gradually grew and spun into a cocoon. Not long after, it broke out of the cocoon. After circling around a few times, it turned into ashes again and continued the process. This was a precious treasure that was born from the same body as her, and it was called the butterfly seed. After she underwent metamorphosis, she had carefully refined it, and it could be considered to be the treasure she was most proud of. After this thing experienced a cycle of life and death, it could be said that it had gone through a cycle of reincarnation. After going through 9 cycles of reincarnation, it would be able to transform into a clone that looked exactly like her, and it could even be said to be identical to her Dao arts. At that time, it would be equivalent to having 2 of her on the battlefield. Even though it wouldn't last for long, it would be sufficient for her to defeat her opponent. It wasn't difficult to stop this thing. As long as she suppressed it with her Fa Li before it matured, she could suppress its transformation. However, she didn't have any intention of hiding it. This was because she was using it to increase the pressure on her opponent. If her opponent ignored it, then when the 9 transformations of the magic treasure was completed, there would be another powerful opponent on the battlefield. However, if she was distracted, then she might not be able to deal with the combined attack of the other 2 magic treasures. Zhang Yan observed for a moment and understood the changes. However, he was still calm because this didn't exceed the limit of what he could deal with. It was just that Zhao Ying's treasures kept coming out one after another, and he couldn't help but sigh. It didn't matter how strong she was still very wealthy. It had to be said that when he fought with Patriarch Yao Han and the others, they had only used 1 treasure each from start to finish. Moreover, he could see that Zhao Ying still had protective treasures on her. This time, even if it wasn't a test, he had to take her down no matter what. This way, not only could he get rid of a powerful enemy, but he could also try to return the magic treasures he seized to the good fortune fragment. He changed his mind. At this time he should show some of his skills. Otherwise, if Chao Ying saw that he could still deal with it calmly, she might retreat out of fear. If that happened, it would be difficult for him to achieve his goal. Last time, when Taoist Yi Han was attacked by Bu Su Tian's mighty force and his supernatural power, he had suffered a great loss. He must have told Chao Ying about this, so it was only natural that he would use this method now that he was being pressured. After thinking about it, he directed his mind, and Bu Su Tian's Weili was activated. After listening to Taoist Yi Han's explanation, Chao Ying had been waiting for the Weili to appear. However, when she felt it now, she was suddenly alarmed. She instinctively didn't want to let the two primordial treasures meet with it. She wanted to test the mysteries of this Weili, but in the end, she gave in to her instincts. With a pull of her divine will, she moved the silver thorn and the enchanted butterfly into the depths of her Fa Li. At this moment, Zhang Yan's gaze had instead become sharp. Originally, Chao Ying only had to carefully withdraw her magic treasures one by one, but at this moment, she'd taken both of them back at the same time, and this had instantly removed the pressure on his body. Although this originally wasn't considered to be much to him, this was obviously the opponent's mistake in dealing with it, and she'd revealed an extremely great flaw. How could he let such an opportunity slip by? At that moment, his Fa Li shook, and while she retreated, he suddenly pressed forward. Chapter 1970. In the instant that Zhang Yan pressed down, he had already made a deduction in the remnant of the jade. His magic power rose in an instant, covering Chao Ying's magic power. At the same time, Bu Su Tian's Weili, which was already on the field, suddenly rose. This was a rare opportunity. Usually, when fighting with peers, such an opening was not easy to find. He didn't need to wait for Chao Ying to reveal all her tricks. At this point, the opponent could only leave behind a protective treasure. Even if she had other powerful tricks, once he grasped the initiative, he could deal with them as they came. Just now, when Chao Ying withdrew her magic treasure, she realized that she had made a big mistake. But just now, when Bu Su Tian's Weili came out, that feeling of fear forced her to respond. As a treasure spirit, there were some instincts that she couldn't overcome. Even if she had to do it again, she would most likely make the same choice. With just one mistake, the balance of power was broken, and the situation became worse. The magic power she had put up in front of her collapsed and shrank under the sudden increase in pressure. At this moment, the tiny gold bead, which was patrolling outside, came down again. She had no choice but to raise the glass scepter in her hand to meet it. When the two collided, her hand was empty, and countless fragments flew out. Just now, when the two magic powers were in a stalemate, the tiny gold bead didn't stop bombarding. Under the repeated resistance, the treasure was already on the verge of collapse. This time, it shattered, like the last straw. She moved her mind a few times, and the scattered fragments seemed to be moving in a swamp, unable to mend. But the tiny gold bead didn't stop. Without an obstacle, golden light flashed, and one after another, it came down. Helpless, she could only rely on her own magic power to slightly delay its momentum. However, this moment was different from before. She no longer had the upper hand in the most important aspect of the battle of magic power. Every single attack landed on her body. Fortunately, she had the protection of a treasured robe, so she was barely able to resist a little. However, she was still beaten to the point that her body trembled and her aura fluctuated. This was not the most difficult thing to deal with. The surging magic power from all directions caused the expanding magic power barrier to be constantly squeezed. If it were not for the flying petals there to slightly restrain it, perhaps the speed of its decline would have been even faster. Anyone could see that if this continued, she would soon be forced to a point where she had no way to retreat. At this time, Taoist Yi Han was also paying attention to the situation here, and he was taken aback. Chao Ying had never fallen into such a predicament in the past, and he was a little flustered. His magic power and cultivation were not as good as Shunchang Boy's. This time, he was only responsible for restraining the opponent. Now that his mind was in a mess, it immediately affected the battlefield, and the magic power that he used to fight back was weakened. Fortunately, he had the golden bell to return his magic power, so he wouldn't be defeated immediately. Under Zhang Yan's fierce attacks, Chao Ying only felt that it was getting more and more difficult. Because she didn't dare to let the treasure of creation collide with Bu Shutian's Weili, her methods were a little constrained. She thought for a while. She still had 1 or 2 tricks left, but they might not be able to turn the situation around. She couldn't help but want to retreat. As long as she could leave, there would be another chance. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He almost immediately felt that his opponent's fighting spirit was shaken. At this time, he naturally wouldn't have any tricks up his sleeves. With a thought, he increased the intensity of his attacks. But at the same time, he was still secretly vigilant. Although his opponent was at a disadvantage, she only wanted to retreat and didn't panic. This was enough to show that she had an escape method that she hadn't used yet. He was considering whether to use Bu Shutian's Weili now, but after thinking about it, he didn't do so. Right now, he had complete control of the situation. Even if his opponent used a method, he could still deal with it. And if he was at his wit's end, that would be the best. When he suppressed his opponent to the most suitable state, Bu Shutian's Weili would definitely be able to suppress him. The situation was slipping in an unpredictable direction, but Chao Ying still didn't move. She didn't really lose the ability to fight back. If she used a method, she would be able to escape. It was just that the price of doing so was not small, so she couldn't make a decision. But now, the danger in her heart was getting stronger, and she knew that she couldn't delay any longer. She pointed with 2 fingers, and with a flash of light, a jade cup flew out of thin air. With a turn of the cup's mouth, Zhang Yan's magic power was swallowed. This was originally Taoist Yi Han's item, but to deal with Zhang Yan, he took it and put it on her. Now it really worked. Then, she threw out the silver spike that she had retracted. This was to block the Tai golden bead so that her mana could be freed. But unexpectedly, when the two collided, she inevitably came into contact with the Bu Shutian's Weili. She only felt that the imprint of her consciousness attached to the magic treasure was washed away. Although it didn't break away from her, it became heavy and sluggish. What was more amazing was that the force actually invaded her mind. Suddenly, she felt that her body was constantly being worn down, and she couldn't help but be shocked. Zhang Yan had been waiting for the right opportunity. Seeing that she seemed to be in a trance, he no longer hesitated. His qi surged, and he suddenly released the refined Bu Shutian's Weili. At this moment, Chao Ying's mind trembled, and she felt a great danger descending. It seemed that if she didn't use her method, she wouldn't be able to escape. Her mind turned quickly. Let's get out of here first. When there's a chance, I'll find this person and get back what I owe him today. She immediately made a gesture, and in an instant, she disappeared into thin air. When she reappeared, she was already in Taoist Yi Han's position, and Taoist Yi Han was in her original position. The two of them had actually exchanged positions. Chao Ying's original purpose was to take down Xinchang Boy when Dozhan encountered an obstacle, because as long as he was caught, their purpose would basically be achieved, and it didn't matter whether they defeated Zhang Yan or not. But now it was impossible to do so, so she could only use it to escape. This time, it was not a complete trap for Taoist Yi Han. She understood that with such a change of direction, Zhang Yan would definitely focus his attention on her. In this way, Taoist Yi Han would still have a chance to escape if he was prepared. Of course, if it was really necessary, she would not hesitate to do so. Because she kept Taoist Yi Han by her side, not only because she wanted to help her, but also because she wanted someone who could take the blame for her in a critical moment. Zhang Yan didn't care about Taoist Yi Han. This person was trapped by the Bu Shutian's Weili and had no way to escape. His eyes turned and found that although Chao Ying was lucky to jump out of the battle circle under the dense magical power, there was a price to pay. She had almost abandoned all her magical power to protect herself, so at this moment, she was at her weakest. As he thought about it, the Tai golden bead flew up, and with a loud bang, it hit her body. Chao Ying only felt dizzy, and her qi was violently fluctuating. Under the continuous bombardment of this treasure, her mind was shaken, and her magical power could not be used at all. Just a moment later, she felt an unknown force surrounding her, and she felt as if she was sinking into a boundless vortex. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her heart. She gritted her teeth and pointed, and the attached butterfly turned and escaped into the void. At this time, she looked up at Zhang Yan with hatred, and like a bubble, she suddenly disappeared without a trace. Seeing this scene, Zhang Yan couldn't help but be surprised. He thought for a moment and calculated in his heart, and almost guessed the way to escape. This person must have used the method of killing herself, and at the same time, leaving the treasure to escape this disaster. Although it was said to kill herself, but the spirit refinement has long been separated from life and death, and there was no possibility of death. However, if one cut off everything from the present world, then it was the same as disappearing from the void, so this person disappeared. Doing this, there was a high possibility that she would fall into eternal silence. However, she had a creation treasure that was coexisting with her, so she most likely had a method to rely on it, and then return. Otherwise, there was no meaning in doing this. Zhang Yan thought about it. If the butterfly was floating outside, it would definitely be afraid of other treasure spirits, so it was very likely that this thing returned to the world. He had not reached the stage of understanding truth, so he couldn't go to such a place, but there was someone who could, so he turned around and said to Child Xinchang, "Fellow Taoist, can you sense where the butterfly escaped to?" Child Xinchang bit his finger and thought about it, then nodded, "Yes." Zhang Yan nodded slightly, "Then I will have to trouble fellow Taoist I to point out where it went." He absolutely couldn't let go of such a great enemy, otherwise there would be endless troubles in the future. As for Taoist Yihan, he was currently trapped by Bu Shutian's Weili. Although it involved a part of his magic power, once Child Xinchang devoured him, he would be free. At this moment, while Ancestor Yao Han and Taoist Zhanyun were confronting each other, they were also paying attention to the changes in the battle situation. When they noticed that Chaoying had disappeared and Taoist Yihan was trapped, they were all shocked. Since the two were defeated, they knew that there was no point in staying here, so they looked at each other and left without saying a word. At this moment, they also felt a little uneasy, afraid that after Zhang Yan resolved this matter, he would join forces with Taoist Zhanyun to cause trouble for them. Taoist Zhanyun watched them leave, but he didn't chase after them. Instead, he instantly came to Zhang Yan's side, cupped his hands, and said, "Just now, someone was trying to stop me, so I couldn't come. Please forgive me, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan returned the bow and said with a smile, "What are you talking about, fellow Taoist? If you hadn't restrained those three, I wouldn't have been able to defeat them so easily." He looked at Taoist Yihan and said, "I still have to chase after the person who escaped, so I'll have to trouble fellow Taoist to take care of this place." Taoist Zhanyun said in a deep voice, "I'll take care of this place. Fellow Taoist can rest assured." Zhang Yan nodded, then took a step forward and followed the qi movement pointed out by Child Xinchang. After a while, a fixed world appeared in front of him. Chapter 1971. Zhang Yan sized it up. The world of determination was like a solid crystal. It was stagnant and lifeless. He had seen the place where Taoist Xinchang resided. It looked like amber. Even though Xinchang was motionless, there was a bit of spirituality inside. The two of them were both treasure spirits, but there was such a huge difference. This must be because they pursued different Taos. He thought about it in his heart. Chaoying was someone who sought help from outside. She was able to comprehend the way of truth. Logically speaking, her understanding of Tao should be far beyond her peers. However, when he fought with this person, he did not feel anything like that. Hence, there should be another reason for this. He guessed that this might have something to do with the twin butterfly. This world of determination was not a door to outsiders. Hence, he had to force his way in. With a thought, a golden light flashed. The tiny golden bead was already launched. Instantly, ripples appeared on the world of determination. Chaoying had not recovered yet. Hence, her resistance was extremely weak. However, he could not rule out the possibility that she was pretending to be weak to lure him in. This was because in the world of determination, one's fighting ability would be amplified to the maximum. However, he did not feel any warning signs. This meant that the possibility was low. If the opponent wanted to kill him, they would have paid a price. Otherwise, they would have used it a long time ago. Moreover, the opponent was only one person left. Moreover, he still had 2 allies outside. Even if he was trapped inside, he would still have help. When the time came, he could still break the world of determination. After summoning the Tai golden orb, he pressed down on it with his will and dermic powers to wear it down. As he continued to erode it, a crack finally appeared in the world. The world of determination was supposed to exist forever. However, after it was forcefully broken by an external force, if it was not maintained by the master's spiritual energy, then it would flow like a river and gradually die. Seeing that there was an opening to enter, Zhang Yan didn't wait any longer. His body didn't move, but with a thought, he turned into a shadow and entered. This was not to guard against the enemy. He was afraid that if he went in personally, his spiritual energy would fight against the world of determination. This would speed up the collapse of the world of determination. If this caused the treasure to escape again, then it would be even more troublesome to find it again. In a flash, the illusory body arrived at the frozen world. He looked around and saw nothing but a barren plain. There was not a speck of dust, and there was no sun, moon, or stars in the sky. There was no wind or clouds. There was only a clear sky. It was like a frozen picture. Although it seemed to be colored, it was too rigid. He tried to use his senses to make a divination and found that the butterfly had indeed landed here. However, when his will reached the butterfly, it seemed to be frightened and hurriedly hid far away. He looked elsewhere and saw that most of the treasures that Chao Ying had brought with her just now had returned to this place. At this moment, they were scattered all around and no one went to collect them. Apart from that, there were also a few scattered good fortune fragments. But right now, the butterfly was the most important. There was no doubt that Chao Ying's consciousness was currently attached to it. Before she could reappear, he had to obtain it as soon as possible. Although the treasure was hiding from him, it was useless. In a situation where there was no master, it couldn't even leave this world of determination. It couldn't hide from him at all. With a command in his heart, his figure flashed. In the next moment, he'd already appeared in front of the treasure, and he merely stretched out his hand and grabbed it with ease. A sense of panic came from the treasure. This was the will it had entrusted to Chao Ying. It was because of this that Chao Ying was able to return to her original state just now. However, there must have been a price for this, or else it would have taken so long to use it during the battle. Now, as long as he refined this treasure, the treasure spirit would never be able to return to the void and would only be able to fall into eternal silence. At this moment, a will of submission came from the treasure. It was mixed with a hint of pleading, as if it was begging him to show mercy. Zhang Yan remained unmoved. There was no oath to the spirit refinement realm, so he was merely making a promise to escape. If he really let it go, then he would definitely be in a completely different situation. He would absolutely not allow such a hidden danger to exist. He pondered for a moment before he flicked his sleeve, and all the treasures and fortune fragments that were wandering around here were swept away. After that, he emerged from World Halt, and he swiftly fused with his main body and returned to being one. He opened his palm and looked at the butterfly. In an instant, a ball of clear light leaped up like a flame. Under his gaze, it slowly melted like wax. At the same time, the remnant will on it turned into many images that continuously leapt out. However, as the object slowly melted, the images also gradually dissipated, turning into nothingness in the end. With a wave of his sleeve, Chao Ying no longer existed. However, this didn't mean that she was dead. There was no such thing as life and death for a spirit refinement realm expert. It was just that without something to entrust her to, she would be driven into eternal silence and would never be able to return to the void. At this moment, the world of determination also melted like ice and headed towards destruction. In just a moment, it completely disappeared. At this moment, he suddenly felt something and turned his gaze to a certain direction. With a faint smile, he moved his feet and returned to where he came from. Taoist Qing Sheng stood in his world of determination. Ever since Chao Ying came to find him, he had been watching the battle. Previously, he had indeed received an item from Chao Ying, but he had no intention of keeping his promise. According to his original plan, Zhang Yan would most likely not be able to defeat Chao Ying and Taoist Yi Han. Thus, he could appear at the most crucial moment and request to release Butian in exchange for saving Zhang Yan. This way, he could achieve his goal ahead of time. However, he never expected that the person who was defeated in this battle would be Chao Ying. From the looks of it, she seemed to have fallen into eternal silence. Just now, when he saw Zhang Yan's gaze, his heart skipped a beat. He knew that the latter had sensed his gaze. He couldn't help but lower his head and ponder. Originally, he had planned to use the excuse of seeking protection to conspire against Butian, but now he didn't think so. In this battle, it was not difficult to see that Zhang Yan's technique was profound and his methods were brilliant. Now that he had a few allies to help each other, it could be said that he had already gained the upper hand. There was no point in playing these petty tricks anymore. The best strategy was to form a good relationship with Zhang Yan. He couldn't help but rejoice that he hadn't shed all pretense of cordiality with Zhang Yan. He still had a door to communicate with him. However, there was still a problem that needed to be solved. This time, no matter what his plan was, in the end he didn't lend a helping hand. If it wasn't for Chao Ying's words, it would have been fine. But since he was involved, he needed to go and explain himself. Zhang Yan returned to his original position in the blink of an eye. Taoist Zhang Yan came to greet him and asked with concern, "Fellow Taoist, how is it?" Zhang Yan replied, "Rest assured, fellow Taoist. That person's item of entrustment has been destroyed by I, so he has fallen into eternal silence. There is no longer any worry of future troubles." Taoist Zhang Yan heaved a sigh of relief and said, "That's good, that's good." Just now, he had seen that Chao Ying had a lot of magic treasures. If he came again, it would be really troublesome. At this time, Zhang Yan looked at Boy Divine Chang. The latter was biting his finger while staring at Taoist Yi Han, who was surrounded by Bu Shutian's Weili. But because of Bu Shutian's Weili, he couldn't enter. He changed his mind. It would have been fine if Taoist Yi Han had been swallowed by Boy Divine Chang. But if Chao Ying had also been swallowed, he didn't know how much her cultivation would have improved. Fortunately, she was already dead, so there was no need to think about it anymore. He said to Boy Divine Chang, "I will leave this person to fellow Taoist. You can do whatever you want. With I here, this power won't stop you." Boy Divine Chang nodded. When Yi Han heard this, he was terrified and shouted, "Can you let me go? Previously, I listened to Chao Ying's orders because of her power. I had no choice. If you are willing to let me go, I can be ordered around by you." Zhang Yan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, ignoring him. Shen Chang Boy approached him slowly. Wherever he passed, Bu Shutian's mighty force did not hinder him at all. However, Taoist Yi Han could not move at all. The fear on his face became more and more intense, but there was a hint of ferocity in the depths of his eyes, as if he had been cornered. Boy Divine Chang quickly arrived in front of him and opened his small hand. Without seeing what he did, Taoist Yi Han turned into a ball of spiritual light and flew into his body. After a treasure spirit was swallowed by its own kind, the primordial essence chi it brought out from the treasure fetus would be lost, and its connection with the world would be completely severed. At that time, it would undoubtedly be thrown into eternal silence. If there was no great fortune, it would never be able to appear in front of many of its peers. Boy Divine Chang swayed a little and yawned. A few lotus leaves appeared on his body, and he lay down on the surface of the leaves. His body was slightly curled up, and it seemed that he had fallen into a deep sleep. Zhang Yan could sense that there were two chi dynamics violently colliding in his body. Although this time it was Boy Divine Chang who took the initiative to swallow Taoist Yi Han, it was also a battle. Whether it could succeed or not, and how far it could go, all depended on its own ability. After seeing the consciousness left by Chao Ying on the magic treasure, he also understood that every time a treasure spirit swallowed its own kind, it had to go through a test. This was also a kind of training for the Tao heart. If it could pass the test perfectly, then its Tao and Dharma power would increase greatly, but if there was a flaw, the harvest would be reduced. The most dangerous situation was to be swallowed by its own kind. Of course, such a situation was not easy to happen. Generally speaking, the one who took the initiative to swallow must be stronger than the other. If it wanted to swallow an elephant, it must be a snake that had the help of an outsider. Although he had helped Boy Divine Chang this time, the latter's Tao was originally higher than Yi Han's, so the possibility of this was not high. At this time, Taoist Zhang Yun said, "Fellow Taoist Shunshang, I am guarding the place. Since you have nothing to do here, I will take my leave." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Thank you for coming to help this time." Taoist Zhang Yun was ashamed. He cupped his hands and bowed, then left. Zhang Yan watched as she left. It was hard to say when the child Divine Chang would come out with an answer, so he didn't pay much attention to her. After a moment, he flicked his sleeve, releasing all of the items Ying had left behind. Chapter 1972. Zhang Yan scanned the area. There were not many things floating in front of him, but two of them were shining brightly and shrouded in clear qi. At a glance, he could tell that they were superior to the other treasures. The most eye-catching one was the treasure cup that Chao Ying used to devour mana. In his sight, there was another treasure that was shining brightly. It was the golden bell that Taoist Yi Han used earlier. After he was taken by the god-devourer Chang Tong, no one took it, and it was left floating in the void. These two items were treasures of fortune. The golden bell was born from the same body as Taoist Yi Han, and the treasure cup was different from the two's qi dynamics. If he was not mistaken, it must have been taken from other treasure spirits. These two items were used for defense. If he did not have Bu Shutian's Wei Li to restrain him, he might not have been able to take down Chao Ying and Taoist Yi Han. Any deity refinement cultivator with these two magic treasures could greatly increase their combat power. It might be enough to fight against peers of the same generation, but it would not be of much use in front of the existence that was about to arrive. At most, it would only be able to hold on for a little longer. Therefore, there was no need to pay too much attention to them. The key was still Bu Shutian. If he could control this place, then he could rely on it for protection. He waved his sleeves and kept the two treasures. The remaining magic treasures, such as the silver hairpin, the flower petal, and the Rui scepter, were all refined by Chao Ying using the good fortune fragment. Besides them, there were also 3 good fortune fragments that were taken from the world freeze. Chao Ying should have carried some things with her, but they were taken away with her when she died. At this moment, they should have fallen into eternal silence. He thought for a while and reached out to take the flower petal. It was moist and red, full and beautiful. However, it was not to his liking, and its ability to slow down mana was useless to him. If he had the time, he might as well add more mana to it. Therefore, he rubbed his fingers, and in an instant, the item dissipated. As the splendor bloomed, it returned to the fragment of fortune. Although this Dharma treasure was not ordinary, it was not born in the land of creation like the Tai golden bead. In addition, it did not have a master's consciousness or magical power, so it was very fragile to him and could be easily disposed of. However, he discovered that the fragments that were returned seemed to be a little less than the original ones. With a quick thought, he understood the reason. Ever since the Great Calamity, while the essence of creation had been scattered into countless fragments, it should not have increased or decreased on the whole. Therefore, the portion that was missing had not actually disappeared, but had instead returned to the various realms. He shook his head. No wonder he didn't see any fellow Taoists doing this. No matter how the missing portion changed, it would have nothing to do with him in the end. Moreover, it was very likely that other fellow Taoists would find it. So, it was very likely that doing this would benefit others. Since that was the case, he would rather not do anything. He didn't care about these things. No matter what it was best if it could be used by him. If it wasn't, then it would be meaningless to keep it in his hands. Previously, he had thought of refining a Dharma treasure to replace him in controlling the refined Baksu Wei Li. However, he didn't have the creation fragment. Now that he had these in his hands, he could do as he pleased. Just one fragment might be a little weak and unable to bear it, but with one more, it would be enough. He looked at the scepter. This thing was also not to his liking. Not only could it be used for defense, but every time it was broken, it needed to be reformed. When used against an enemy, it needed to be controlled. Even just now, the petal was much more useful than it. Therefore, he didn't hesitate. With a flick of his finger, the scepter shattered in an instant. This time, it didn't reform. Instead, it turned into countless sparkling light spots that gathered in his hand and turned into a ball. Looking at it carefully, he found that it was also missing a little. He didn't care. The two fragments combined were enough for him to refine a Dharma treasure. With a serious expression, he poured his consciousness into it. Not long after, the two fragments gradually turned into two halves of the dragon ring jade annulus. Then, he gathered the refined Buksu Whaley and sent it into the jade annulus. The moment the Whaley entered the jade annulus, it was restrained by the Dharma treasure. Not a single strand of it leaked out. He nodded. In this case, he could only release it during the battle, and he would be able to defeat the enemy. With this refined dragon ring jade annulus and the treasures he obtained, it was perfect for both offense and defense. At this moment, he couldn't help but think of Ancestor Yao Han and the others. He wondered if he should kill his way to their door and kill them in one fell swoop. This way, he wouldn't have any trouble in the future. However, when he thought of this, he suddenly felt a sense of danger. He raised his eyebrows and was slightly surprised. Although his magic power and cultivation hadn't increased by much, the techniques he had were much stronger than before. If he fought against Ancestor Yao Han and the others, he wouldn't be able to fight them head-on. But now, it would be difficult for him to win. He tried to divine it but found that it was a complete mess. He couldn't find anything. He pondered for a moment and guessed that there might be some powerful figure behind this junior. However, it was just a thought and he didn't need to do anything to this junior. After all, this junior was not as threatening as Chao Ying. Since it would be troublesome to make a move now, he could put it aside for now. When he could control Buksu Tian and had a place to rely on, it wouldn't be too late to find trouble with them. After making up his mind, he threw these thoughts aside and sank his consciousness into Buksu Tian to continue comprehending the mysteries of the Grand Tao. Just as he thought about it, Ancestor Yao Han and the others felt a sense of danger in their hearts, and their expressions turned cold. Taoist Yu Lu calculated for a moment, then looked at the other two and said, "This should be related to Taoist Zhang." Taoist Yu Qiu guessed, "Could it be that Taoist Zhang wants to take revenge on me after I stopped him from saving him?" As soon as he said this, the three of them looked at each other and realized that it was highly possible. Taoist Yu Lu said solemnly, "If he comes looking for us, I'm afraid we won't be able to stop him." They had seen the entire battle. If Zhang Yan could defeat Chao Ying and Taoist Yu Lu head-on, it wouldn't be difficult for him to defeat the three of them. What made them even more afraid was that Zhang Yan had used some unknown method to trap Taoist Yi Han. If such a method could be used to suppress them, it would be very frightening. Although they weren't treasure spirits and weren't afraid of being devoured, if they were trapped, they would lose the initiative and could only be at the mercy of others. Taoist Yu Qiu sighed. That Taoist Zhang's methods are even stronger than before. He's already so difficult to deal with, and now he's made friends with a few others. If they all attack together, what can we do to stop them? Taoist Yu Lu shook his head. If it's just these people, then it's fine. At worst, we won't get entangled with them. I'm just afraid that those two from Quan Dao will also come to add insult to injury. Patriarch Yao Han's expression was somewhat gloomy. When Taoist Yi Han came looking for them, he had promised to give them some benefits. But in the end he even died, so the so-called benefits were gone. Now, they, who hadn't done anything, had to bear the consequences. Although they were originally enemies with Zhang Yan, if he hadn't been defeated so quickly, why would Zhang Yan come looking for them first? He said, "Fellow Taoist Yu Lu, are you sure that Chao Ying is no longer here?" Taoist Yu Lu pondered for a moment and said, "In my divination, I haven't found any traces of this person's aura." In the end, he also used the art of sustenance to perish. If this art isn't used well, once the object of sustenance is destroyed, it'll be difficult to return. but it's also possible that he's still drifting around. Taoist Yu Qiu sighed. Regardless of which possibility it was, it seemed that he couldn't block the path for them now. Patriarch Yao Han pondered for a long time and said, "Actually, the two of you don't need to be afraid. Have you forgotten the place we were looking for? As long as we can hide there, we won't have to worry about Taoist Zhang coming for us again." Taoist Yu Qiu hesitated and said, "But that place has an owner. I'm afraid it'll be inappropriate for us to occupy it." Patriarch Yao Han advised, "Ever since the creation essence shattered, that person disappeared long ago. It's very likely that he's fallen into eternal silence. Previously, we were afraid of bearing the karma of that person, so we didn't move. Now that we're taking refuge, we can't worry about such things." Taoist Yu Lu nodded and said, "That's reasonable. This place was originally the place they chose to hide from that existence, but for some reason, they didn't move. Later, when they found clues about Bu Shutian, they put it aside. Now that it was impossible to seize Bu Shutian, and danger was imminent, it was better to hide there." Seeing that the two agreed, Taoist Yu Qiu no longer objected. After the three finished their discussion, they immediately began to move. Because there were many places they hadn't explored before, they didn't immediately search for it. Right now, they could only rely on the clues they had collected in the past to slowly move forward. During this process, they didn't encounter any obstruction, which was enough to prove that the owner of that item was no longer here, so it couldn't affect them. After realizing this, they couldn't help but relax. After putting in a lot of effort, the three of them finally found the location. The three didn't waste any time, and with a thought, they arrived in front of an item. This item was oblong, like a mirror-like lake. It was difficult to tell how big it was, and no matter how they looked, they could only see the side facing them. It was like there was an opening in the void. Taoist Yu Lu said solemnly, "It's here." Patriarch Yao Han said, "In the past, that person didn't even open the world-stabilizing realm, and relied on this item to block many enemies. It shouldn't be a problem for us to use it to avoid that Taoist Zhang. If we manage it well, we can also avoid that person." Taoist Yu Qiu sensed something. Although he didn't feel any danger, he still felt that something was wrong. He said, "Has no one come here in the past?" Patriarch Yao Han said, "Since this item is still here, it means that even if someone found it, they couldn't get it. Since they had found this place, there was no reason to retreat." The three looked at each other and walked toward the mirror-like surface, quickly entering it. But the moment the three entered, the figure of a Taoist slowly appeared on the other side of the mirror-like lake. He looked back, smiled deeply, and disappeared in a flash. Chapter 1973. A strand of Zhang Yan's consciousness was immersed in Bu Shutian. Every time he felt like he was about to lose himself, he would withdraw in time. However, he also found that as his cultivation increased, the time he could immerse himself in Bu Shutian increased as well. This meant that his original body could bear more of the mysteries of the Great Path. Even so, the depth of Bu Shutian was still as difficult to fathom as before. This time, after defeating Chao Ying, he threw in another 3 fragments of good fortune. In addition to what he had before, he now had the number of good fortune fragments on his palm. However, this was like a grain of sand in a vast ocean. For Bu Shutian, it did not seem to have any effect at all. Because there were no external enemies to disturb him, he was able to meditate for a long time. Gradually, the number of times he went out to meditate decreased. Occasionally, his consciousness would withdraw once. However, when he felt that he had reached the limit of what he could bear, he turned his consciousness back. However, he found that he did not return to his original body. Instead, he was standing in a place that seemed to be empty. He suddenly felt something and looked up. He saw a blurry shadow in front of him. It looked like a Taoist walking with his back facing him. That familiar yet strange appearance was obviously him. However, when he wanted to take a closer look, the person seemed to feel something. He paused for a moment but did not turn back. Instead, he sped up and left. His eyes became deeper and his heart was calm. It was obvious that he had expected this situation. In a trance, the scene shattered and he found himself back on his original body. he thought to himself. Just now, that person must be Wan Zhen. He tried to calculate and realized that a long time had passed since he went into closed-door cultivation. Based on how the spiritual energy of the spirit refinement realm fought against each other, if this was in the modern world, it would take billions of years and it would be hard for him to get close to this stage. However, this was a little faster than he expected. Don't look at this small difference. At his level, as long as it was not something that exceeded his ability, then everything could be calculated. Now that there was a deviation, there must be something that he did not calculate and overlooked. He thought for a moment and thought that this might be because the Tao that he was pursuing was different from others. At this time, he suddenly sensed movement outside and looked to the side. The lotus leaves parted and Boy Chong seemed to have woken up. However, he did not seem to be fully awake and was lying on the lotus leaves, unwilling to get up. He thought for a moment. From the looks of it, the outcome of this battle had already been decided, and this person was unsurprisingly the final winner. However, it could be seen that the mass of essence Qi had yet to completely transform into his own. This was normal. Of course. Even the treasure embryo that Boy Chong had secretly swallowed had taken a long time to be completely absorbed. This was normal. Previously, Boy Chong had secretly swallowed it of the treasure embryo of it. This was actually a good thing for him, as he would be well behaved for a long period of time. He retracted his gaze and scanned the surroundings with his consciousness. His eyes flickered. Previously, he had felt that something was wrong with his surroundings, but he didn't pay much attention to it as it didn't affect him. Now that he looked again, he was certain that the magic power of Patriarch Yao Han and the others had disappeared without a trace, and he couldn't feel any of it. This situation was extremely unusual. Even if one of the three of them managed to break through the gate of understanding the truth and hide inside the fixed world, it was impossible for all three of them to hide inside the fixed world at the same time. Since the fixed world accepted outsiders, their magic powers would clash with each other. For example, Taoist Zhanyuan tried his best to avoid entering Taoist Shenchang's fixed world. He couldn't help but think of the warning that appeared in his heart when he thought of the three of them. Could it be that they really have some kind of relationship with a powerful peer? That's why he sought protection? Or did he find a place similar to Busu Tian and hide there? He pondered for a moment. No matter what it was outside of his current abilities. There was no point in delving into it. It was better to focus on cultivation. As long as his cultivation became stronger, there would be a way to solve anything. Moreover, the test of comprehending truth was right in front of him, and there were still some flaws that he had yet to solve, so he needed to plan properly. When a cultivator killed Wan Zhen, it was the same as fighting against another him. Everything that he knew, Wan Zhen also knew. Moreover, because Wan Zhen was reflected from the God's will when he arrived, he could not use any magic treasures that had not been fully refined and were not in the God's will. As for the magic treasures that had been fully refined, he also had the right to control them, so they were not very useful to him. Wan Zhen was even more different. Because he was seeking for himself and for others, it was reasonable to say that his cultivation was higher than Wan Zhen's. Therefore, when the time came, it was very likely that his cultivation was slightly higher than Wan Zhen's. However, there was another possibility, and that was that Wan Zhen's cultivation was slightly higher than his. The reason for this situation was that the path he had taken was much broader than the two mentioned above. In order to obtain more, he had to pay more. Wan Zhen's cultivation would also increase. Just like how he could see Wan Zhen before he reached the gate of understanding the truth, it could be a sign that such a sign would appear. Therefore, even if there was a trace of such a possibility, he had to find a way to be prepared. It should be known that between the real body and the Wan Zhen, there was no difference between their magical powers and methods. Therefore, this slight difference in cultivation might determine the final success or failure. At this moment, he had a feeling that when he really passed this test, some of the doubts that he had in the past might be answered. He pondered for a moment. Now that he was not alone, he could take this opportunity to ask his fellow Taoists. Maybe he could learn some useful principles from them. Thinking of this, he immediately separated a shadow and came to find Taoist Zhenyuan's Qi. Taoist Zhang Yuan did not open the world stabilization technique. His real body was residing in a broken magic tool that looked like a fine house. When he sensed Zhang Yan's visit, he came out to welcome him. He cupped his hands and said with a smile, "It turns out that fellow Taoist has come to visit. Please come in and have a chat." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and followed him into the inner room. After looking around, he sat down at the seat invited by Taoist Zhang Yu. Taoist Zhang Yun sighed and said, "This is the magic treasure that I used before I became Taoist. Speaking of which, this is the only thing that I brought out of the present world. I couldn't bear to give it up, so I left it behind." Zhang Yan also sighed. Usually, the present world that the spirit refinement cultivators were born in would eventually collapse one day. Only the present world behind him, because it was connected to Bu Su Tian, the land of creation essence, so it had existed for a long time. Taoist Zhang Yan exchanged a few words with him and then asked, "I see that you have been cultivating all this time. May I know why you are here today?" Zhang Yan said, "Recently, I saw the change of Wan Zhen and thought that I would pass the realm of understanding the truth. I thought that you had already passed this test, so I came to ask for some advice." Taoist Zhang Yan was surprised and said, "Fellow Taoist has already reached that stage?" Then he thought again and nodded, "It should be. If a cultivator could pass the Wan Zhen, restrain their magic power, and open up the realm of stopping, they would have the ability to protect themselves. However, although this stage was extremely difficult and could be seen as a dangerous path, if one were to look at it from the perspective of realms, it was still within the first stage. Only after crossing it and those who sought external help had enough resources would they have the chance to enter the second stage. It was said that when a cultivator reached this stage, there would be more changes, but he had not reached this stage, so he did not know." He pondered for a moment and sighed, "If you ask me how I passed this test, I can only say that I was very lucky to pass it that day. Now that I think about it, if I tried again, I would most likely be stopped here." He raised his finger and a ball of spiritual light appeared at the tip of his finger and sent it forward. "Everything I have lost and gained is in it." Zhang Yan looked at it and the spiritual light shone into his body. In an instant, he gained all kinds of enlightenment. However, it involved many fighting methods which were not shown. He understood this very well. If it were him, he would also hide it. The harvest here had already exceeded his expectations. He raised his hand to salute and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Taoist Zhang Yun shook his head and said, "Everyone's Tao path is different, so I might not be able to help you much." Then he gave another suggestion. "Now that fellow Taoist Shunchang has returned to his original state, you can go to his place and see more." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. After thanking him again, he said goodbye to Taoist Zhang Yuan and went to Taoist Shunchang's realm of stopping under the guidance of Taoist Shunchang's qi. Just now, he saw the door open, and a spiritual light came out to welcome him. He stepped forward and landed in the world freeze in an instant. He looked around and found that the last time he left, this place had changed greatly. Now, it was even more different. The mountains and rivers were magnificent, and all the stars were present. Except for the fact that there were no living creatures, it was no different from the ordinary world. At this time, Taoist Shunchang appeared in front of him and said, "After I recovered, I wanted to visit fellow Taoist first. However, I saw that fellow Taoist was cultivating, and I was afraid that I would disturb you, so I gave up on the idea. This time, fellow Taoist has come to visit me, so please stay a little longer." Zhang Yan returned the salute and said, "Thank you for your hospitality." However, he noticed that Taoist devotee Constant was very different from the last time he saw him. He was less depressed, and more cheerful and carefree. After splitting his consciousness into two, he had solved one of his problems, so his state of mind had improved a lot. Taoist Shunchang came down and welcomed Zhang Yan to the top of the Dharma pagoda where he cultivated. Zhang Yan chatted with him for a while and said, "Fellow Taoist, you must already know why I'm here." Shunchang Taoist nodded and said with a smile, "The trial of deciphering truth is extremely perilous, and everyone is different. However, there are tricks to it as well, and I was lucky enough to pass the trial with this method." Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. "Oh, I would like to ask." Although Taoist Shenchang's state of mind was not as good as Meng Qi's, he was, after all, gifted by heaven. There were some things that he was born to know, and this was his strength. Taoist Shenchang pointed at himself and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist, you must know that the Dharma will fade, and so will the mind. Although stubborn truth is born from God, it is still a reflection of my body." At this point, he paused and said, "There is something to be done." Chapter 1974. Hearing this, Zhang Yan pondered for a while and immediately understood the meaning behind Taoist Shenchang's words. A cultivator's own qi and qi were not always static. The real situation was like the waves of the ocean. Not only the self, but also the confrontation between the cultivator and the cultivator's qi would also cause the waves to rise and fall. It was just that the waves on the surface of the water would not be able to cause any turbulence in the depths of the ocean. What Taoist Shenchang said about winning the hearts of the cultivators was actually referring to the changes in the hearts of the cultivators. A deity ascension cultivator's mind and qi were one. If the mind died, then the qi would no longer exist, and the cultivator would fall into eternal silence. However, on the other hand, the stronger the qi, the stronger the qi. If the mind was alive, then the qi would naturally rise and fall. It was impossible for it to remain the same. Thinking about this, he was enlightened and asked, "Fellow Taoist, are you referring to the time when your qi is low and the wanjin appears? That way you will be able to suppress it?" Taoist Shenchang laughed and said, "That's right. However, how do you grasp it and when will the wanjin appear? This is especially important. Otherwise you will hurt yourself." He then exclaimed, "Fellow Taoist, you know that I am the manifestation of a treasure spirit. I am born with supernatural powers and have yet to gain experience. Therefore, my state of mind is much more unstable than yours. However, when I passed the enlightenment stage, it was because of this that I gained some benefits." Zhang Yan understood. Because Shenchang's state of mind was unstable, his qi would fluctuate and fall. Therefore, his qi would fluctuate. When the wanjin appears, it would only reflect that moment. However, if he was at the moment when his qi was at its weakest, then he would encounter a wanjin whose qi was slightly weaker than his. Do not underestimate such a small difference. If both parties had the same methods and supernatural powers, then the difference of one's qi would be like the difference between heaven and earth. Even if the battle was endless, there would still be hope of winning. There would not be an endless battle. After understanding all this, he also understood that even though this method was dangerous, there was still a trace of heaven's secret that he could climb. However, knowing it was one thing and doing it was another matter. According to Taoist Shenchang, there was no way to predict when the wanjin would emerge from the spirit. Even he himself did not know. In fact, luck played a part in his success. Once the wanjin appeared, there would be no hope of victory. Therefore, the possibility of failure was not small. He pondered in his heart. What if he could grasp the moment the wanjin's reflection appeared? Thinking up to here, a vague idea appeared in his mind. He raised his hand and bowed, saying, "Thank you for dispelling my doubts." Shenchang Taoist quickly returned the courtesy and said, "Taoist friend, you're being too serious. I'm just going ahead of you, and I dare not be careless. However, the wanjin test is no small matter, and the more prepared you are, the better. I think that you should pay a visit to St. Qing again, and perhaps you might be able to benefit from it." Zhang Yan reacted immediately and said, "Qing Sheng was here before? Is it about what happened last time?" Shenchang Taoist praised, "Taoist friend, your mind is clear." Zhang Yan understood now. Previously, when Zhao Ying came to his door, Taoist Qing Sheng did not come out to help. Instead, he was suspected of colluding with Zhao Ying and Zhao Ying. He must be afraid that Zhang Yan would completely close the door to Busu Tian, so he wanted to find a way to apologize. However, Zhang Yan happened to be in isolation, so he came to Shenchang Taoist. Shenchang Taoist saw that he was thinking and thought that he had some concerns. He said, "Taoist friend, are you afraid that this person will know of your cultivation progress? That is not a problem. Now that my mana has recovered, and with Taoist Zhang here, he will not dare to act recklessly. Zhang Yan smiled and said, I am not worried about this. Since he asked you to come, he must have no other thoughts for now. Shunchang Taoist said, it is good that Taoist friend can think this way. The most important thing is to pass the test of understanding the truth. If you can pass the test and comprehend it, then the rest can be put aside for the time being. Zhang Yan nodded. He was not worried about this. Judging from Qing Sheng's behavior, he was a person who valued benefits. If he really had a way to suppress Zhang Yan, he would not have come to him with kind words. Now that he had sent out a signal of reconciliation, it meant that he did not intend to use force. Shunchang Taoist's expression turned solemn and said, nowadays, there are fewer and fewer people who seek help from others. I hope that Taoist friend one will be careful. Zhang Yan knew that he was afraid that he would be replaced by Naughty Zhen and that he would have one less person who sought after him. Thus, out of kindness, he reminded him to be careful. Zhang Yan also appreciated this kindness and smiled, I know what to do. Thank you for reminding me. Since he had gotten what he wanted, he bade farewell to Shunchang Taoist. With a flicker of his shadow, he came out of the stoppable world. Then he stretched out his hand and a green jade talisman fell into his hand. This was left by Qing Sheng last time, and it could be used to summon him. He activated his mana and a ray of light appeared on the jade talisman. After a while, Qing Sheng's silhouette appeared from the talisman. Qing Sheng took a look at him and bowed. So it's you who have come out from your seclusion. Zhang Yan smiled and returned the bow. He said, I have a question today. Taoist Shunchang said that he might be able to get an answer from you. Please forgive me for disturbing you with the talisman. Hearing this, Qing Sheng seemed to have noticed something and could not help but look at him. Even though the latter was just a shadow, he could still sense some clues and said straightforwardly, what are you talking about? If you have any questions, I'll tell you everything I know. Zhang Yan said straightforwardly, I am about to reach the stage of understanding the truth. Among the people that I know, only you have the most profound cultivation and you might know the mystery behind it. Qing Sheng's expression became more serious. He said, I dare not. Previously, when you were besieged, I did not come to help. It was my fault. Since you have asked, I can tell you that I have the right to make up for what I owe. Speaking of which, if Zhang Yan's cultivation improved, it would be detrimental to his plan to take over Bu Su Tian. However, if he refused this time, he might not be able to seek shelter in Bu Su Tian anymore, so he had no other choice. Moreover, Zhang Yan could negotiate with others now, but if it was Wan Zhen, who knew if he would have the same thoughts as him? Of course, there was another important reason. Zhang Yan did not hide this matter in front of him, which meant that he was very confident. Maybe he already had the confidence to pass the stage and just wanted to be safe, so he came to ask. If that was the case, there was no need for him to be the bad guy. He could just do him a favor. He paused for a moment and said in a deep voice, You asked me how to pass the test of stubbornness, but you are wrong about that. Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. But where did you go wrong? Qing Sheng looked at him and said, I did not pass the stage of Wan Zhen. Actually, I am the Wan Zhen that you are talking about. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. He looked at Qing Sheng and said, Is that so? Then I would like to ask, how did you defeat the real Wan Zhen? Qing Sheng actually replaced the real Wan Zhen, which was unexpected. However, the Wan Zhen and the real Wan Zhen were the same. No matter who won or lost, there must be a reason for the winner to win. Qing Sheng stared at him and asked, Aren't you afraid? Zhang Yan laughed and said, I'm not acquainted with the original Taoist Azure Saint. Taoist Azure Saint has his own rules and you're not a crazy person. Why should I be afraid? Qing Sheng said in a deep voice, That is not what I meant. I am asking if you are not afraid that you will be taken advantage of by Wan Zhen after listening to my theory of Tao? Zhang Yan smiled and said, You are the one who says it, but I am the one who listens. If I cannot pass the stage, it is because I am not fated, my state of mind is not satisfied, and my cultivation is not strong enough. It is not because of what you said. Moreover, if Wan Zhen replaces me, it means that he is better than me. Wan Zhen is not me, But I am still me. Even if he wins, what is there to be afraid of? Qing Xing nodded and said, Brother, you have your own plans. I apologize for asking too much. He paused for a while and continued, Since you are willing to listen, I will not hesitate to tell you. Zhang Yan said, Please elaborate. Qing Xing said in a deep voice, The reason why I can win against the original is not because of any tricks. It is because my Tao is better than his Tao. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, My Tao, regardless of whether it is Wan Zhen or Wan Zhen, isn't it all about seeking your own Tao? Qing Xing said, My Tao is different from his. His state of mind is not stable and he has doubts about seeking his own Tao. He is not as pure as I am. Comparing the two, he is weaker than me. When Zhang Yan heard this, he seemed to understand something. At the same time, he thought of something and asked, Since you are a stubborn Taoist, does it mean that you have awakened your consciousness before you appeared, or did you only realize yourself at the moment you were born? He had asked the most important secret of Wan Zhen. Qing Xing was silent for a long time and said, I cannot answer your question. I only know that I know everything about the original. Zhang Yan thought for a while and asked again, If that's the case, how do you know that you're that stubborn? Was it not because he had killed Wan Zhen with his true body, causing his mind to change? Qing Xing said matter-of-factly, This is the difference between me and the original. If I am the original, I might be disturbed. However, my Tao heart is firm. If I do not see all the obstacles, I will not be confused. Zhang Yan nodded. Qing Xing's Tao heart was indeed pure. Once he had decided on the Tao path, he would not be shaken. Therefore, confusion and self-doubt did not exist in him. If he said that he had decided on it, then it was so. Even if he did not, it would still be the same. Although this was his Tao, Shen Lian could use it as a reference. He bowed and said, Thank you for telling me the truth. Qing Xing bowed and said, Recently, I have found a fragment of creation. After you have passed this test, I will pay you a visit. Zhang Yan said no more and returned his consciousness back to his body. He then fell into deep thought. The Xinshang Taoist started from the state of mind, but the Azure Saint's words went one step further than the Xinshang Taoists. He started from the Tao. It was as if there were two people in this situation. One was born from the heart, and the other was born from the reflection of the Tao. Thinking about this, Yi Futian's heart skipped a beat as he felt that he had grasped the key. Chapter 1975. What Zhang Yan thought of was that the two of them were born from stubbornness, and they both landed in the most unstable areas of their cultivation. This was not a coincidence, because only the weakest parts of their cultivation could be easily broken through by stubbornness. From this, he also thought that the Taoist was not only a trial for cultivators, but also a process to make up for their weaknesses. For those who sought for themselves, because they focused on themselves, they used their willpower to push their cultivation. During this process, they would naturally conform to the great Tao, and the change of the Taoist came about because of this. This was not an obstacle for cultivators in their cultivation, but a cultivator's own desire. For those who did not seek to improve, or tried to suppress their own cultivation, they would never encounter this trial. And where were his weaknesses? Compared to his peers, his state of mind and mana could be said to be flawless. However, there was nothing perfect in the world, so there must be a shortcoming to be found. He pondered for a while and thought of something. Whether it was Taoist Xinshang, Qing Xing, or Chaoying, all of them were seeking one of the two Taoist paths outside of themselves. He was the only one who sought for both paths, or in other words, he did not care about the two sides of the path. He did not know if anyone had done this before, but now, it was obvious that he was the only one who cultivated like this. Since there was no other Tao technique that he could use as a reference, there must be a flaw in the integration. This required him to constantly deduce and perfect it as he moved forward. However, this was obviously a shortcoming here. Therefore, the Taoist was likely to come from his own Tao technique, and he might encounter a more complicated situation. He did not regret this, because once this path was taken by him, he would be able to go further than anyone else in the same generation. After thinking about all these, he roughly sorted out the matter and had a clear idea in his mind. Next, he only needed to raise his cultivation and slowly deduce the changes. When the Taoist arrived, he just needed to find a way to kill it. With his mind set, he sank his consciousness into Bu Shutian. After an unknown amount of time, just as he was about to reach the real trial, he suddenly felt a sense of danger. He immediately withdrew his consciousness and opened his eyes. He saw a Taoist in a gray Taoist robe in front of him. The Taoist looked ragged and had no facial features. His body was hard to distinguish, as if half of it was reflected in the void. His eyes flickered slightly. Putting aside the fact that the other party did not trigger any waves of mana, there were no signs of it either. It was enough to show that his cultivation was superb. What was even more amazing was that the moment this person stood there, the large amount of mana that was pouring in from the outside no longer existed. It looked as though it was being pushed away by him. He shook his sleeves, stood up, and said, "May I know who you are? What are you here for?" The faceless Taoist didn't say anything. He just transmitted a thought and said, "I hope you can stop cultivating. However, there's still the enlightenment stage." Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. Given his level of attainment, someone with a high level of attainment would be able to sense it from the ripples of mana. For example, when he met Qing Sheng, the latter was able to sense his intentions. However, from the looks of it, this person seemed to have known about this beforehand. If that was the case, perhaps this person had been paying attention to him since a long time ago. He looked over and said, "Since you want I to do this, can you tell me the reason?" The faceless Taoist was silent for a moment before he transmitted his thoughts. "You should know the person who has harmed everyone." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The faceless Taoist continued, "The higher the cultivator's cultivation, the higher the possibility of this person appearing. If you succeed, it's very likely that this existence will come earlier. Therefore, you need to stop cultivating so that you can protect your fellow Taoists." When Zhang Yan heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. "As far as I know, there is more than one person in the void who has a higher cultivation than me. If you think that the higher the cultivation, the more hindrance it is, then why don't you look for others, but I? Isn't this putting the cart before the horse?" The faceless Taoist did not answer this question. He only said, "I only want to know if you are willing to stop." Zhang Yan's eyes were slightly cold. According to what the person said, if he improved his cultivation, it would attract this existence. However, if he did not improve his cultivation as much as possible to control Bu Su Tian as soon as possible, when this existence really appeared, he would not be able to resist. The faceless Taoist's request was to use his own interests to fulfill the others. Not to mention that if this person was able to tell him the exact reason, then perhaps he would be able to consider it and find a suitable method, and he might even be able to see a trace of the profundities of the Grand Tao through this. But now, it was absolutely impossible for him to stop with just a few words. He looked over and said lightly, "Please forgive me for not being able to agree to your request." The faceless Taoist said, "If you are not willing, then I have to stop you." Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said, "I will wait here." The faceless Taoist did not choose to make a move. Instead, his body slowly drifted away and disappeared. Zhang Yan looked at the place where the figure disappeared and his eyes narrowed. He knew that it was not that this person was avoiding the battle, but that the battle had already begun. This person's method was extremely clever. Just after he arrived, he had completely blocked out all external senses, and he could no longer sense the mana of other people of the same generation. Until now, it was as if he was the only one left in the entire void. It was very likely that this was not just blocking him alone. People like Shenchang Taoist and the others certainly could not sense him, otherwise they would definitely come to help. Whether it was Chao Ying or Qing Sheng, they had never shown such magical power. This was enough to show that this person's cultivation was extremely high, perhaps beyond any of the people of the same generation that he had met before. This person did not attack him now, not because he was waiting for him to change his mind, but because he wanted to avoid a head-on fight with him. He believed that as long as he continued to understand the Jiezhen Pass, this person would definitely come to disturb him. It was clear that this person was not letting him focus on his cultivation. The most dangerous thing was that because he had blocked out his mana, he did not know where this person was. Therefore, it was difficult for him to even initiate a fight. In reality, if he was disturbed during the battle with Wang Zhen and lost, it would not stop him from improving his cultivation. This was because no matter if he won or Wang Zhen won, they would still pass this pass. The reason why this person did this was to prevent him from taking this step. This was because no cultivator would be willing to be replaced by Wang Zhen. This was also the reason why this person showed up in advance to give him pressure. Otherwise, he could have attacked him when he was about to kill Wang Zhen. He thought about it carefully and realized that this person had indeed grasped the key point. Unless he could hide in Bu Su now, he would not be able to completely ignore this person's threat. However, there was one thing that this person did not expect. Although the past Wang Zhen was in danger, it might not be the same for him. He had an advantage that others did not have, and that was the broken jade. Once he had a specific direction, he could deduce in advance. If he failed once, he could deduce twice, and if he failed twice, he could deduce thrice until he found a way to kill Wang Zhen. However, if he did not discuss Dao with Shen Chang, Zhan Yuan, and even Qing Sheng, he would not be able to find the right path so quickly. However, if he did not have a deep understanding of Dao, even if he knew all these, it would not be of much use. Both were indispensable. Once he found a way to kill Wang Zhen, as long as he remained calm and was not disturbed, the faceless Taoist would not be able to do anything unless the faceless Taoist was willing to fight him face to face. Now that he had the Bu Su Weili and a few ultimate treasures, he was not afraid. He immediately sat down, sank his mind, and entered the broken jade. In a place where it was hard to see, the faceless Taoist was watching Zhang Yan's every move, but he did not come out to disturb him. This was because he could sense that Zhang Yan's qi was very stable, which meant that he was not comprehending Dao, but was simply sitting still. He would only take action when Zhang Yan showed signs of breaking through the barrier of truth. Zhang Yan repeatedly deduced in the broken jade. After a long time, his mind withdrew. At this moment, there was a strange light in his eyes. He had found the way to break through the barrier of truth. With his current realm, as long as he found it once, he could completely deduce it without any mistakes. However, in his deduction just now, he realized that he didn't have to deal with one stubborn being, but two. Of course, they did not appear at the same time. Just now, after killing one, he would encounter the other one. However, what puzzled him was that the Wang Zhen was transformed from the marks of existence. Logically speaking, there should only be one, so where did the second one come from? He pondered for a moment and said, could it be because of the predecessor? This was very likely, but he thought that there was another possibility, which was that it came from the body of strength. Because the Wang Zhen was transformed from two marks of existence, it meant that he had two shortcomings at the moment. One was from the Tao, which was no doubt, and the other was most likely from the body of strength. However, whether this was the case or not, it was still impossible to verify. He was afraid that he could only wait until his body of strength reached this level. Just now, it was possible to know the truth. However, with this method, he had already made up his mind, but now he needed to test it to see how it would react if he did so just now. Therefore, he sank his mind and tried to comprehend the Tao. At first, there was no movement. However, as he gradually went deeper, he suddenly felt a boundless magical power attacking him from the outside. He knew clearly that with his opponent's ability, he could totally do it without making a sound. However, he just had to make such a huge commotion. That meant that the opponent was trying to disturb him. He immediately responded by spreading his mana outwards, and at the same time, the tiny golden beads suddenly flew out and crashed into the opponent's mana. However, with just a slight contact, before he could determine the strength, the opponent's mana disappeared without a trace, as if his power had landed on thin air. He retracted his mana and continued to look like he was comprehending, but the mana quickly returned, so he stopped again. Every time he started, the opponent would definitely come to disturb him. In short, he would not be able to calm down. After trying many times, he knew that as long as he grasped the right opportunity, he could kill the Wang Zhen before the opponent could make a move. Once this was over, it would be time to deal with the opponent. Chapter 1976. After that person's fatally retreated once again, Zhang Yan knew that there would be a period of time before that person hid himself and attacked again. If that was the case, then there would be a period of time that he could make use of before that. However, this did not rule out the possibility that the opponent deliberately exposed this flaw to wait for him to fall in. Therefore, before he killed Wang Zhen, he still had to do the necessary preparations. After a little preparation, his mind focused on the inside. As he moved, the qi on his body immediately became deep and serene. The faceless Taoist immediately sensed that something was wrong, and his mana surged out from the void. However, when it came to Zhang Yan's side, he saw light flashing on his body. The treasure cup and the golden bell jumped out at the same time, and the mana that attacked him was either retreated or swallowed. However, after a pause, the mana ignored the two magic treasures as if they were nothing. It passed by them and directly pressed down on him. When Zhang Yan saw this scene, he couldn't help but think. He faintly sensed something. However, the most important thing now was to kill Wang Zhen, and it wasn't the time to pay attention to these things. Moreover, no matter how formidable that person's mana was, he was still delayed for a moment just now, and that gave him a chance. If it was someone else, who would dare to kill Wang Zhen under such a threat? However, after repeated deductions, he already knew the changes. This moment of stability was enough for him. He immediately sent his consciousness into Bu Su Tian. In the midst of the chaos, as his cultivation advanced, there was a moment when he suddenly felt a blur in his consciousness. A figure that was exactly the same as him suddenly appeared. Seeing this, he knew that the fate law had arrived. Because he had prepared well in advance, Wang Zhen was inferior to him in both Dao and mana. Therefore, there was no need for any fancy tricks, and he only needed to use all his mana to crash into it. In an instant, the two mana collided in this divine will. After all, Wang Zhen had the same means as him. Even though he was at a disadvantage, he was still well prepared, and there was no sign of confusion. He even had the strength to fight back. However, he had this slight advantage. As the battle progressed, he could accumulate this advantage bit by bit until it could be infinitely magnified. Unless something went wrong, there was no way he could turn the tables. However, this was almost impossible. Not to mention that there had already been countless deductions in the remnant jade. Even if there had not been, there would not have been such negligence. But even so, it wasn't easy for him to win. After fighting with Wang Zhen for tens of thousands of years, he finally succeeded in killing him. However, he did not retreat from the divine will and continued to wait with rapt attention. Moments later, another naughty Zhen appeared. This stubbornness was not something that he could completely predict in advance. The appearance of this spirit was also reflected by the aura in his spirit. It could be said that it was no different from his current state. Here, he did not have an advantage in terms of dermic powers and Dao techniques. However, there was one thing that Wang Zhen did not have. That was because through deduction, he knew exactly when Wang Zhen would come out. Therefore, he could seize the initiative. When two people with the same means and divine powers fought, the one who seized the initiative would definitely have the upper hand. As long as this situation could be maintained, the possibility of defeating the enemy would not be small. This was actually the method that Taoist Zhang Yuan used to kill Wang Zhen. However, he did not know when Wang Zhen would come out, so he had been discharging his dermic powers in the divine will. This method seemed simple, but it was not easy to do because it could not be disturbed by any external forces. In case of an enemy attack, when he sank into the divine will again, Wang Zhen might be waiting for him there. Fortunately, Taoist Zhang Yuan had Taoist Shunchang to protect him at that time, so he was unharmed. Because of this, the two of them could entrust each other as allies. However, there was still a great deal of luck involved. This time, Zhang Yan found out through his divination, especially from the moment he killed the first Wang Zhen to the end. Nothing could be different from what he had predicted, or else the result would be different. Fortunately, everything went according to his plan. This time, the two sides fought for a longer time. Both sides had endless dermic powers. In the end, it was impossible to calculate how long it took. Zhang Yan finally killed Wang Zhen by relying on his advantage of being the first to kill him. Once he had settled down, his mind immediately withdrew from it. No matter how long the battle in the divine will lasted, it would only take a moment in the outside world. However, this moment was already a different world. At this moment, the attacking Wang Zhen's dermic powers were just now in front of him. His eyes flashed and his mind changed. The dermic powers around his body surged, and he rushed forward. In the faceless Taoist senses, Zhang Yan's qi activity suddenly surged. Whether it was his Dao or dermic powers, they were all greatly improved. After killing Wang Zhen, he made up for his shortcomings, which led to this change. As soon as he sensed the flow of qi, he instantly knew that Zhang Yan had used some unknown method to pass the barrier of unraveling truth, and he'd come here today precisely to stop this. But now that Zhang Yan had succeeded, there was no point in staying here any longer. So he circulated his magic energy, and it vanished like a receding tide. Seeing this, Zhang Yan circulated his dermic powers, and a clear light suddenly appeared in his eyes, illuminating the silence. At this moment, he was very different from just now. He could faintly sense the existence of his opponent. At this time, when he looked carefully, he saw a shadow. He would not be polite, and with a thought, the tiny golden bead came crashing down. After being hit, the faceless Taoist's dermic powers fluctuated, and he was forced to retreat from the illusion. But when the tiny golden bead came crashing down again, the treasure actually passed through his body. Just now, after seeing the faceless Taoist skills, Zhang Yan knew that the dermic treasures were probably useless against him. But he already knew that the tiny golden bead this time was only to restrain the faceless Taoist, not to defeat the enemy. Seeing this, he immediately used a backup plan. With a thought, Bu Shutian's Weili was immediately activated, and it came crashing down. The faceless Taoist originally wanted to disappear, but this time he could not escape. The Bu Shutian's Weili could not be pushed away, and he was trapped inside. The faceless Taoist was a little surprised, but he also knew that he could not escape, so he simply did not struggle. He looked up at Zhang Yan and said, "After you pass through this pass, that person will come soon. What can you do to stop him?" Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said, "If this person comes, how do you know that he will destroy me and not me?" As soon as he said this, Xian Qi fluttered behind him, and then a steady stream of Weili surged up. After passing through the Enlightenment Pass, he felt that it was easier to control the Bu Shutian's Weili. Although the faceless Taoist in front of him was not a treasure spirit and could not be swallowed, he could trap him here and not let him escape. But at this time, he found a trace of strangeness. Under the pressure of the Bu Shutian's Weili, the faceless Taoist's figure gradually faded, and his magic power gradually disappeared. Finally, his whole body slowly drifted away, leaving only a broken mask floating in the air. Zhang Yan's gaze became slightly gloomy. He stretched out his hand and took the mask. After looking at it for a moment, he was able to determine that this person wasn't a true cultivator, and it was probably a great figure that had placed his will on this item. The reason why this person was able to manifest and go against him was because of this item. Perhaps this thing had something to do with the essence of creation. Now that it had been soaked in the Bu Shutian's Weili, and since it had failed to stop him, its obsession had disappeared. With the defeat of the faceless Taoist, the surrounding magic power fluctuations became clear again. Zhang Yan put away the mask and looked around. He saw that boy Shunchang was still there, but he was sleeping soundly, as if he had not noticed what had happened just now. After a few breaths, two familiar magic powers appeared. Then, Taoist Shunchang and Taoist Zhanyuan appeared. Taoist Zhanyuan looked around, cupped his hands, and said, "Fellow Taoist, just now, I saw that your magic power was blocked for a moment. May I know why?" Zhang Yan replied, "Just now, while I was cultivating, someone came to disturb me. What you two felt was the doing of that person." He briefly explained what had happened just now. Taoist Shunchang's expression became solemn. He said, "If it is as you said, and this person is only a wisp of obsession, then it is very likely that his cultivation is superior to ours." Taoist Zhang pondered for a moment and said, "This person did not come with his real body. Perhaps there are some restrictions, or perhaps he has entered eternal silence, and only this obsession remains in the silence." Taoist Shunchang seemed to have thought of something. He pondered for a while, then raised his head just now and said, "That person said that when fellow Taoist Zhang's magic power has improved, that existence will be attracted. Perhaps it is not directed at you alone, but this person's obsession is different from ours." Zhang Yan asked, "Why do you say that?" Taoist Shunchang said, "Some people once thought that because of the improvement of our cultivation, that existence pointed to the great way and touched the nameless, and just now, it has been attracted. If all the spirit refinement remains as it is now, and there is no change in our cultivation, then this person will not appear." He paused for a moment and said, "I noticed that there is something wrong with your qi. Have you already passed the Jianjun test?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "After talking with you, I gained some enlightenment and was able to pass this test." Although Taoist Shunchang had already guessed it, he could not help but be shocked, because Zhang Yan had obviously killed Wanjun under the threat of an external enemy. Such ability was really amazing. He calmed his emotions slightly before he said, "No wonder that person came looking for you. With fellow Taoist ability, you might really be able to find the door of the Grand Tao. In that way, it would be extremely easy to draw that existence over." Zhang Yan shook his head in his heart. According to his thinking, if one encountered a powerful enemy, one should find a way to deal with it. Even if one avoided it, it was only to temporarily protect oneself, and in the long run, the goal was to destroy the enemy. Now, this person actually thought that the only way to avoid the enemy was to restrain his own cultivation. Not only did he do so, but he also used his cultivation to obstruct the path of others. He was the most stubborn and conservative Taoist cultivator he had ever met. Taoist Shunchang reminded, "Don't be careless, my friend. This person will not stop until he achieves his goal." Although this time, the spiritual imprint was destroyed by you, it is not certain that no one will come. Zhang Yan nodded. Now that he had passed the Jianjun test, he could open up the world stoppage and conceal his mana. In this way, it would not be easy for the opponent to find him. Moreover, in the world stoppage, his defense would be better than before. Even if that person came looking for him, he would not be able to do anything to him. Chapter 1977. Shunchang and Zhang Yuan discussed with Zhang Yan for a while. They believed that they still needed to guard against this person's return. However, this person had the ability to conceal his mana, which was tantamount to cutting off the possibility of them joining forces. If this person still had lingering thoughts in the void, then the next time he came, it would not be Zhang Yan, but the two of them. In that case, they might not be able to resist. Therefore, they needed a way to break this restraint, but they also had to be able to fight back. Zhang Yan thought for a while and came up with an idea. He opened his palm and pulled out 2 strands of Bushtian Whaley that he had refined. They turned into 2 jade talisman and said, "The two of you can carry these things with you. If this person comes again, I can use them to help you." As long as Shunchang and Zhai Yuan had this thing with them, he would be able to track them down without needing to sense their qi activity or mana. Even if the enemy tried to isolate them, it would be useless. And with these things, if this person sent more lingering thoughts to this place, he would not be able to do anything to them. This was because the treasure of lingering thoughts was usually related to the essence of creation. If it did not belong to this category, there was usually no way to carry the consciousness of the Spirit Refinement Almighty. But just now Dozhan had proved that this kind of thing alone could be easily restrained by the Bushtian Whaley. The only thing to worry about was that the opponent was coming. But the Bushtian Whaley itself was endless, so even if there was only 1 strand of Whaley with them, they could use it to attract more. But he still needed to do it himself. Shunchang and Zhang Yuan did not know what it was, but seeing that Zhang Yan did not explain, they did not ask any more questions and took the jade beads. Seeing that there was nothing left to do here, the two of them thanked him and bade farewell. Taoist Shunchang, however, was a step behind Taoist Zhang Yuan. After the latter left, he turned around and said, "Fellow Taoist, I've just now done some calculations in my mind, and there are indeed signs of that existence appearing a little earlier than expected. That faceless Taoist's words are not entirely nonsense. Don't be careless, fellow Taoist. With that, he cupped his hands and left. Zhang Yan's eyes were deep and serene. He knew that faceless Taoist's words could not be nonsense, because after he confirmed it, it already had some kind of truth. What's more, Shunshang Taoist and the others had chosen to believe it to a certain extent. At least they did not completely deny it. As a result, even if this wasn't the case in the beginning, as more and more alchemists started to believe in it, it would slowly turn into the truth, and this in turn would push this matter forward. Just like now. Previously, he was unable to detect that existence, but now he could vaguely sense it. This was probably not only because of the improvement of his cultivation, but also because his fellow Taoists believed so, which made this statement one step further into the truth. Unless he had a way to reverse the perception of all his peers, he could not change the situation. But if he had such an ability, he would not have to worry about this person. He thought about it carefully. According to faceless Taoist's words, the higher one's cultivation, the easier it would be to attract that existence. Therefore, the most reasonable situation should be that the existence would not allow anyone with a higher cultivation to appear. Otherwise, it would be meaningless for the existence to come out. And when a cultivator's cultivation gradually approached that existence, it might be the time for the existence to come out. But no matter what, since he could not stop this person from coming, he could only choose to face it. It was absolutely wrong to retreat and be conservative, for it would be equivalent to giving the opponent the right to choose. While he was thinking, he felt waves of magic power and knew that more guests had arrived. He looked up and saw two Taoists coming together. It was Taoist Quan Dao and Taoist Zhan Yuan. These two were originally comprehending the Great Tao, but suddenly noticed that Zhang Yan's magic power was fading and hiding, and immediately realized that this was a sign of the past stubbornness. At this moment, the two were also threatened by that existence. After learning of Bu Shutian's existence, they very much wanted to seek protection from him. But looking at Zhang Yan's situation, it was obvious that he was coming down to open up the world. If they did not see him now, it would be very difficult to find him after he succeeded, so they hurriedly came to find him. The Taoist standing on the left came up and said, "I would like to congratulate fellow Taoist for passing the test of understanding the truth." In the past, they were very reserved in front of Zhang Yan, but now that the latter's cultivation was higher than theirs, their attitude changed. Zhang Yan smiled and bowed. Then, he said, "Why did the two of you come back to look for me?" The Taoist on the right was silent for a while, then said frankly, "We will not hide it from fellow Taoist. Because of the threat from that existence, we have been looking for a way out, but until now we have not found such a place. Later, we vaguely heard from other places that there seems to be a place where you can seek protection. Now that I have come to see fellow Taoist, I want to ask, if that existence comes, can you let us in to hide?" The Taoist on the left said, "If fellow Taoist agrees, we can hand over the good fortune fragments in our hands to fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan thought about it. He did not care much about the good fortune fragments, but in the future he would have to face that existence, so the more allies he had, the better. But the premise was that he could control Bu Shutian, so before he achieved this goal, he would not let anyone in. Thus, he said, "I cannot promise the two of you now, but when the time comes, I will give you an accurate answer." When the two heard this, they were happy. Zhang Yan's spiritual power was now above theirs, so even if he rejected them, they could not do anything. It was already good to have such a reply, so they immediately bowed and thanked him. At this moment, Zhang Yan thought of something. Seeing the two of them here, he asked, "Do the two of you know where Yao Han and the others went?" The Taoist on the left said, "We have our suspicions as well. We have been keeping an eye on him, but he suddenly disappeared without a trace. We privately speculate that he has gone to some place, but we can't deduce anything at the moment. If it's not that he has the protection of a highly skilled Taoist, then he is hiding in some world." Zhang Yan nodded. This was in line with his speculation. He said, "I still have things to do here, so I will not keep you too." When the two of them saw this, they tactfully cupped their fists and left. After sending the two off, Zhang Yan calmed himself down and sat down. After passing the challenge of understanding truth, not only did he completely erase his mark of being in the world, he also made up for his shortcomings. It was just that as his cultivation increased, new flaws would appear. This was something that could never be made up for. But it was also because of this that his cultivation could improve. The biggest gain from this was that his spiritual power and cultivation had greatly increased. This was what he relied on to open up the world. With a change of heart, the spiritual power that was originally spreading out slowly retracted, and all the spiritual power that was fighting against him gradually weakened. This did not mean that the spiritual power would not come here anymore, but under his will, it would never touch him. In other words, the power that he gathered surpassed the expansion of his peers. This was something that he could not do before killing Wan Zhen, because it required even more spiritual power. Just now, he was able to get rid of his peers and achieve his goal. Because he avoided the entanglement of many spiritual powers, after a long time, his spiritual power seemed to have disappeared from the void. Of course, this was not true disappearance. If that was the case, then he would be isolated from the world and fall into eternal silence. Right now, he was only infinitely close to this. The deeper his spiritual power receded, the further away he was from his peers, and the harder it was for others to find the world he opened up. However, this place was also dangerous. If he was not careful, he might fall into it and never be able to return to the void. Zhang Yan had already deduced this in the past, so he was well aware of it. As he went deeper and deeper, he sensed that he'd already arrived at his limits, and then his divine will stopped here for an instant. At the same time, a world freeze that was like a jade cocoon suddenly opened up. Clear and misty light emanated from within it, and then it instantly formed the world, the universe, the sun, the moon, and the stars. He sensed it slightly and found that as long as he was here, he would only be connected to this world, and he would not be able to sense the other worlds. This ensured that he would not fall into eternal silence, nor would he fight against his peers. It was as if he was in the gap between the two. It was no wonder that it was difficult for outsiders to find the location of his world. As long as he, the master, did not go out, it meant that he did not exist to his peers. However, there were still traces. It was as if that existence came, he would definitely be able to find the location of the world. Otherwise, the almighty cultivator who opened the world would not be in such a hurry to find a place of refuge. Only by controlling the cloth as soon as possible could he truly be safe. At this moment, he pondered for a while and took out the mask again. He wanted to use the weak connection to try to find where the faceless Taoist came from. He did not do this before because he was not fully prepared. Now that the world was opened, even if the faceless Taoist came again, he would not be afraid. His divine will followed the karmic connection and traced back to the source. Not long after, he saw a place. It was a mirror lake, and it was unknown how big it was. It looked like it was embedded in the void, but no matter how he looked, he could only see the side facing him and could not see the back. After that, all the karmic connections were completely severed. There was no doubt that this person had appeared from here. He could now confirm that this person was indeed not in the void. Otherwise, he would not have been able to find this place so smoothly. At this moment, he tried to explore, but found that whether it was magic power or chi dynamic, he could not see the situation inside. After thinking about it, he thought that this should also be a place of refuge. Although the faceless Taoist would prevent other people from improving their cultivation, it did not mean that this person would pin all his hopes on this. He would also find a way out, and it was very likely that this was the place. After taking a deep look at this place, his consciousness returned to his real body. He then looked at the world behind him, and a wisp of consciousness had already sunk into Xianyuan heaven. Chapter 1978. When Zhang Yan's consciousness entered Qinghuan Palace, he sensed something strange in his heart. It was as if there was something in this world that was incompatible with the outside world. It was like a speck of dust landing on a flawless white wall. He couldn't help but look over and suddenly found that there were several places that seemed to be in the present world but were different from the present world. However, when he looked at those places, they suddenly disappeared as if they had never existed. No matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find any trace of them. He was somewhat familiar with this situation. It was as if the Xian stone was not affected by any external force. As long as he tried to search for it, it would automatically hide. He pondered for a bit. Could this be where the real Chaos Heaven was? This was possible. He couldn't find it in the past because his cultivation was still weak. He had previously guessed that the ancestors of the sect had ascended to this world. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but become interested. He immediately formed a spell and tried to divine it. In the past, no matter how he searched, this place would always be empty, but this time he found something. Not long after, he saw that one of the realms was faintly discernible. In about 2 to 3 years, it would have an intersection with the world he was in. It was also because of this that he was able to sense it so easily. At that time, as long as a powerful cultivator managed to break the door, he would be able to find an opportunity to enter. He became spirited. As he continued to divine it, he found that it was very likely he would miss it. This was because the future was filled with countless variables. If there was an external force or if Bu Shutian changed, causing the Xian stone to appear early, it would deviate from his current divination. Then this boundary would no longer appear. However, he couldn't actively participate, or else the evolution would be disrupted. Thus, he could only choose to let nature take its course. He thought about it and felt that there was no need to force it. Since he could see it as long as his cultivation increased, then once he controlled Bu Shutian, he would be able to see the mysteries. Thus, he gathered his thoughts and looked toward the heavens of the present world. It turned out that in order to prevent Ancestor Yao Han and the others from implicating him in karma and using this to find Bu Shutian, he had completed his Dao cultivation. Other than a few people, he did not speak of this matter to his sect or even to his disciples. Not to mention that the 3 of them had already disappeared. Even if they were still around, it would not be difficult for him to suppress them with his cultivation and magic treasures. Thus, he was no longer a threat. Now that he'd kept his enemies out of the world and severed his own stubbornness, it was time for him to proclaim the Tao and spread his qi throughout the heavens and the earth to clearly tell all living beings in the world that all things should be controlled by him, and all worlds should be ruled by him. As soon as this thought arose, the bell within Qinghuan Palace instantly rang loudly, and the deep and distant sound instantly spread throughout the myriad of worlds in the world, and all living beings in the world heard it. No one told them, but they naturally knew what had happened. There was a supreme being in the void who had transcended beyond all worlds. As the sound of the bell rang, it turned into a wisp of ethereal Tao sound. At this moment, those who heard it felt as if there were endless mysteries leaping into the depths of their souls, and unknowingly, they were immersed in it. For some reason, they understood that this was because the grand supreme Tao ancestor was born in this world and felt the virtue of creation. Now that he had plucked the fruit of Tao, he was giving it back to all living beings. However, the door to the great Tao still depended on fate. Those who were not fated to hear it would forget it in an instant, and when they tried to find it later, they could no longer enter the door. Those who were fated, on the other hand, trembled with excitement, and felt as if they could die without regrets after hearing the Tao in the morning. At this moment, within the remaining heavens, Dan Yi, Michihito Ichito, and even Fu Qingming and the others could not help but hear the rules of the great Tao. When Taoist 1K opened another heaven, they already had some guesses about Zhang Yan's path, but the result was too shocking, and they still did not dare to believe it. Now they could undoubtedly confirm it. Dan Yi sensed the wondrous great Tao that was passed down, and he felt that the profoundness within was truly inexhaustible. It was still easy to understand at the beginning, but as he went deeper, he soon felt that it was difficult to understand. However, he soon discovered that he could actually use this wondrous Tao to deduce the path ahead of him. Seeing this, he immediately tried to deduce whether he had a chance to achieve Tao. However, after this round of calculation, the result was that his cultivation was lacking, and his magic power was especially weak. He was unable to break through the stubborn world at all, let alone open that door. Although he had long guessed that this would be the case, after clearly knowing that there was no hope for him, he also sighed regretfully. Once he made up his mind, There was no more sound in his ears. At this moment, Fu Qingming and Michihito Ichido were also there, listening carefully to this faint sound. However, because one of them had no intention to climb to the upper realm, and the other had long since cut off the thought of Tao, they did not have these worries, and only immersed themselves in the principles of Tao. Fortunately, these were all deliberately passed down by Zhang Yan, so no matter how they listened, they would not be lost in it, and at most, they would forget it afterwards. Qinsong School, in the upper extreme hall. Qi Yuntian stood on the platform with his hands behind his back, listening to the grand sound of the bell. As if he heard the sound of Tao, he did not move for a long time. After a long while, he sighed. Hall Master Duzhen has achieved the upper realm. It is my Qinsong School's great fortune. Since the head of the sect is not here, I should personally go and congratulate him. When I am not here, Yue, help me take care of the matters of the sect. If there are any difficult matters, wait for me to return before we discuss. Standing behind him was the eldest disciple of the sect, Guan Yue. He bowed and said, "Disciple respectfully accepts the decree." In the boundless pool of thunder at Anjin Temple, Zhang San was originally in a state of calmness, but when she suddenly heard this voice, she opened her eyes and looked up into the sky. Others could only hear the sound of the Tao, but she felt a sense of familiarity from it. She couldn't help but sigh softly. She was both happy and shocked. Big Brother has finally reached that step. However, with Big Brother's heart and spirit, this isn't difficult to imagine. Zhang Yan was sitting in the hall deep in thought. He used the sound of the bell to evolve the sound of Tao, which was equivalent to enlightening the living beings in the universe. For the almighty cultivators of the God refinement realm to do this personally, the benefits they would receive would be immeasurable. In the universe, countless living beings received the law of fate and had the possibility of entering Tao in the future. As for those who had already begun to cultivate, their path of cultivation would also be broadened. He did not think about this before, but he suddenly felt that doing this would be beneficial to him, so he did it conveniently. However, when he thought about it, he did not know why he did it. Because it seemed that no matter how the living beings in the world evolved, it would not affect him. If this world was not connected to Busu Tian, when the river ran out, it would completely disappear. So maybe this was still related to Busu Tian? He saw that he could not find an answer at the moment, so he did not pursue it. 3 days later, the sound of the bell finally weakened and could not be heard anymore. Jingyu entered the hall and reported, "Master, a few venerable ones have come to congratulate you. They are waiting outside the hall." Zhang Yan said, "Call them in." Not long after, Lu Yenyi, Wei Zihong, Yuan Jianqing, and the rest of the disciples who had cut off their mortal bodies came to the hall. They saw their master sitting on the jade platform, and above him, there was a mysterious cloud that covered the sky. Behind him, 5-colored light shone through the universe, and it was difficult to see the shape of the qi. They all came up and bowed, saying, "Disciple greets Master. Congratulations on entering the upper realm, Taoist Master Taishang." Zhang Yan smiled and asked them to get up. Because of the various changes in the void, it did not affect the real world. So even though he had cut off his mortal body, not much time had passed in this world, so the disciples' cultivation did not improve much. However, they were still his direct disciples, so when they heard the sound of the Tao, they all had some understanding. He gave them a few words of advice, and with a thought, a few talismans floated down and landed in the hands of the disciples below. He said, "Although I have seen you enter the upper realm, the Tao is boundless, and you need to be vigilant at all times. This is what I made. If you encounter any danger, you can use this to escape to a place of protection." The 3 disciples received the talismans, and they all thanked their master for his kindness and kept them well. Zhang Yan looked at Lu Yenyi and said, "I have already calculated that within 100 years, Kai Wei and Kading will have the fate to enter the Tao. As my eldest disciple, you should pay attention." Lu Yenyi bowed and said, "I will remember, and when the time comes, I will personally receive the 2 junior sisters and return to Master's seat." Zhang Yan also gave Wei Zihong and Yuan Jianqing a few words of encouragement and allowed them to stay in the Qinghuan Palace to cultivate, and then he ordered them to leave. On the second day, Dan Yi and the other two came to congratulate him. In the past, they had only heard rumors about the divine will, but now that Zhang Yan had succeeded, they could not do so, and to show their respect, they all came in person. Although they could not enter the Tao, they admired the glory of the upper realm, and after they entered the palace to congratulate him, they could not help but ask about the matter of spiritual cultivation. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Without entering the realm, it is difficult to understand the reason, but even if I speak clearly and explain all kinds of methods, I will not be able to enter your ears." The three of them were deep in thought. At this time, Dan Yi asked, "May I ask Palace Master Qinghuan, have you seen a fellow Taoist?" Zhang Yan smiled, but he shook his head and did not speak. It was not that he did not want to tell them, but as long as the people in this world knew the name of a Taishang, then their consciousness clone might appear from the god. If it was a friendly alliance like Xin Chang and Zhan Yuan, it would be fine, but if it was someone like Yao Han Ancestor or Qing Xing, it would be the same as letting the enemy in. Although he did not say it explicitly, with Dan Yi's cultivation, it was not difficult for him to feel this, and he knew that he had asked something he should not have asked, so he quickly bowed and apologized. "I was rash." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "It's fine." The three of them were afraid of disturbing his cultivation, so they did not stay for long and soon left. In the following days, Qi Yuntian and the heads of the major sects came to congratulate him, and when everything calmed down, it was already half a year later. Zhang Yan's consciousness did not leave, but sat in the Qinghuan Palace, waiting for the arrival of that place. In his senses, it was getting closer and closer to that place. He waited for 2 years, and suddenly, there was movement outside the universe, and it was like a star falling into the world. He woke up from his meditation, and after a brief calculation, his eyes flashed, and he pointed with his finger. In an instant, a door slowly opened in front of him. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.